listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America, and from across the increasingly divided surface of our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that makes us Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Good morning again, everybody. It's August 3rd. It's just past 7 a.m. in the morning, and we've got headlines for you. Let's get into COVID news. First up, big news today. Biden has reached the vaccination goal. About, a month late, a little bit, depending on how you measure a month, more than 28 days. But he set the vaccination goal for July 4th. It is now August 3rd, so it really depends on how you define a month exactly. Mm-hmm. But we reached it. And it's sad because this is at a time when faith in vaccines is waning. I'm not going to say that it is at its lowest because I have no idea how low it's going to get. And because, frankly, a lot of people were very cautious about the vaccine, still are. And, I remember late last year particularly, plenty of Democrats were like kind of anti-vaxxy.
Yeah.
When Trump was pushing them.
Yeah.
Anyway, my point is, it's getting low. So this is a bad time for the vaccination rate to be so high when people are so cynical about them. But still, overall, objectively, I think is good news. This comes as the single-day caseload is increasing quite dramatically. After yesterday, we saw a fairly low caseload, just a few tens of thousands of new cases. Today, we're up to over 135,000 new COVID cases reported in the United States. That leaves us with about 454 new deaths. Over the past week, we've had an average of about 85,866 cases per day. That's an increase of 142% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 50% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. I like how it coincides. 70% of the adult population, that was Biden's vaccination goal, coincides with 50% of the total population. Like the numbers ticked up on the New York Times source thing that I use for the total adult vaccinated population from 49 to 50. It is just a convenient round number. Anyway, this comes as 58% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 35,175,000 people across the United States. It has killed about 613,400 of us. And again, we haven't seen this high a single day caseload in like months. I was looking at it and it was early February the last time, so about 6 months ago, and that was near the peak of the cold and flu season. If we keep heading in this direction, we will inexplicably resurrect the nature of that cold and flu season in the summer this time, even though it was in the winter. We're getting closer. In national news, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo was grilled by the two officials investigating allegations of sexual harassment against him. For about 11 hours, Cuomo was videotaped while being interviewed by June H. Kim and Ann L. Clark, who were appointed by New York's Attorney General Letitia James. This interview followed months of interviews with former and current aides to Cuomo who have accused him of sexual harassment. During the interview, Cuomo reportedly suggested that Kim had an axe to grind with him. After Kim investigated Cuomo's shutdown of an anti-corruption panel in 2014. The District of Columbia's police department has stated that two more officers who responded to the January 6th riot have committed suicide. This brings the total number of suicide by officers who responded to the event to four people, which is its own kind of sad, small epidemic. In international news, Ukrainian police are investigating the murder of a Belarusian dissident and activist who organized a house for exiles from Belarus in Ukraine. After the man was reported missing, he was found hanged with a broken nose. At least 40 Afghani civilians have been killed in the last day as fierce fighting is ongoing between the Taliban and government forces over the province of Helmand. Thousands in Kandahar and Lashkargah have been displaced. China is set to test the entire population of Wuhan for coronavirus cases as the case count ramps up in the country. Authorities have attributed the increased spread to the raging Delta variant. In Olympic news, Simone Biles competed in the balance beam event yesterday and took bronze. Biles was seeded in 7th, but jumped to a 3rd-place finish. She lost gold to 16-year-old Chinese sensation Guan Chen. Second place was the other Chinese gymnast Tang Shijing Tag. This is almost certainly the last medal for the 24-year-old Biles, but she is reportedly very proud of what she was able to overcome.
Yeah.
Belarusian Olympic runner Kristina Simanowskaya, has been granted a visa from Poland after she was nearly forced to fly home in the middle of the games. Kristina publicly criticized her coaching staff. That sparked a heated debate back home in Belarus and prompted the regime to crack down on anti-government folks generally. I'll get into the specifics. Kristina was brought to the airport and refused to board, instead approaching police before seeking asylum from the International Olympic Committee and social media. So far, the medal leaders in order are the United States and China. They're tied with 68 total medals. Behind them are the Russian athletes, then Great Britain, then Japan. China has the most gold medals, however, with 32. The U.S. is following at 22, and Japan is sitting in 3rd place at 18. Those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo grilled by the 2 people investigating him basically on the sexual harassment stuff. Kind of a big deal.
Yeah.
This is the next step in that investigation.
Yes, it is. I mean, and depending upon what this turns out to be, Cuomo, so goes Cuomo. If she comes out and says, yes, he is guilty, Cuomo is going to have problems. If she comes out and says, okay, nothing to see here, Cuomo gets, I guess, on some level, a pass. I mean, if she comes out and says, okay, fair enough, there were charges against them, there was questionable behavior, but not necessarily behavior to the point where he would be, I don't know, prosecuted. Then what? I don't know. I mean, I'm very interested in whether or not Cuomo runs again. I'm just, at this point, I'm more curious about it. And maybe that curiosity is going to go into whether or not Cuomo gets prosecuted in general. So, I don't know. I mean, I know that he wants a 4th term. I know that if he can put one foot in front of the other, and if this doesn't take him out of office, he may run again.
Yeah.
So, I mean, he's a dominant political figure. I wouldn't necessarily count him out. And I know I was joking with Ted, but I'm beginning to think that joke was serious, that he actually may stay there for a 4th term. What's to stop him? And I still think he's probably going to use Eric Adams and the gun and, fighting crime and that type of thing. I think that's probably going to be his way in. That would be my way in if I was looking for a way to justify myself for another term.
My image of how this stuff goes is biased by New York City, which you can imagine is a dominant force in the state of New York, but isn't the only force. And so it's like, I'm thinking like, okay, if Cuomo manages New York City well, if Manhattan comes back in a roaring way or whatever, you know what I mean? That was sort of my lens at first, but that's not exactly right, because New York City is not New York, and he has many other constituents to appeal to and a lot of the population.
Well, he had Ted Raw. He was like, oh, they don't care about the city. They care about Albany.
And that's from a city dweller.
Yeah, it's very
With
weird
a little bit of the
when you
tinge
frame
of-
it. It's like, what? Because it feels like New York City is New York. That's how it feels.
That's kind of that's the distinction I'm drawing, and I don't know what it is. And we've heard that from Ted, and I'm sure that that's true. But there are probably other sides to it too, But I guess my point is, I don't know exactly what it looks like, but how I imagine it going is, if Cuomo can bring New York City back in a big roaring way, then he'll take it. You know what I mean?
Yes. Because
the problems with crime that you're mentioning right now, those are problems that cities are having to deal with across the nation. And if New Yorkers see Cuomo, if they see statistics showing that under Cuomo in the last year, New York's faring far better than those other cities, if the economy comes back, if some sense of everything that was lost during COVID-19, if you can, bring little bits of that, plant them in places.
Yeah. Because he needs to do a few things. He needs to get the businesses back up and running. He needs to get people back up and go into those businesses. He needs to cut crime down, because people don't necessarily like to get hit over the head when they're shopping or buying whatever they're buying. So, yeah, I agree with you. Put it this way, if it's in a couple of months and New York is doing better than, let's say, California, it's doing better than some of the other states that it's balanced against, yeah, I don't think he's going anywhere.
And okay, so we've been having this conversation, but we would be remiss if we didn't bring back up. We've only actually touched on one of the 3 scandals.
Yeah, the killing of the grandmas.
The killing of the grandmas.
Kim, the brutishness where he scared the man's wife, where she shook like a leaf for 15 minutes after the phone call. Something like that.
That's what it was. Yeah, I think it was an assemblyman. Something Kim, exactly.
Yeah.
I'm forgetting his name. It might be Ron Kim. I need to
No,
look
it's
into
Kim. Because he was going after Cuomo for Ron Kim. He was going
Exactly,
after
Ron
Cuomo
Kim.
for
That's what I was trying to recall.
basically constituents. I mean, the people who he were putting in the nursing homes and dying, those were his constituents.
That's what he was going after him for.
Yeah.
For something that you should be going after Cuomo for. And then Cuomo gave him like an angry call at night that left Kim feeling a bit shaken about his the future of his political career. And apparently his wife was like, "Oh no!"
His wife was listening on the side, shaking like a leaf.
Extra shaken,
shaking like a leaf. And then he says, "Are you an honorable man?" That's the part that got me. He said, "Are you an honorable man?" And then when Kim answered, Cuomo just launched into this attack that just shattered. I mean, that's just an amazing thing, right? I mean, you are guilty of what he's going after you for. And you call him to browbeat him and saying, how dare you bring this up?
how dare you kick me while I'm down?
How
Something
dare you?
I don't know. Yeah, it's also arbitrary. It's also pure power politics on the one hand, but on the other, it's also really interesting to see it breaking out, to see that kind of interaction. Those are the things you'd imagine. Like again, Cuomo's not New York City mayor; he is clearly New York governor.
Right.
But you'd imagine the big tycoon of a city cracking down in all of his corrupt force to squelch a local politician or something like that. That's what you imagine, like in the background of a Batman comic. You know what I mean? And you can see that happening in real life, but it's just I hear about it is a little bit.
Yeah.
funny.
It's very wild.
No, he's not killing people. It's not that far.
No. It's just all that stuff hits the news all at once, and all of a sudden it's like, whoa. And what's wild about it, they knew Cuomo was like this in New York. Nobody was surprised by this. Like when Kim brought this up, nobody was like, whoa, Cuomo was doing. Everybody knew. Everybody knew. They knew what his personality was. They knew what his temperament was. They were terrified of him. And on some level, they were terrified of him because of that. And, you can do that stuff when you're doing that stuff behind the scenes. It's like when all that stuff hit at once, he looked bad. But now he's looking one day in front of the next, one leg in front of the other. It depends on what these reports are going to come out with. If these reports come out with something damning, if they don't, fourth term.
Now, what if they come out with something damning, but he's super popular at the time, and so they don't actually take him out? Wouldn't that be a weird and screwed up?
It depends on what it would be. Like if he's committing sexual assault, can you withstand that?
If it's not criminal, which is if it's sexual assault, it would be by definition.
Yeah,
I get that, but you were saying borderline.
Yeah,
but
if it's kind of weird borderline
if
stuff.
it's clearly a moral violation, very, very, very clearly a moral violation, but it doesn't exceed the level of a crime. That's my point. It doesn't meet that level.
Yeah.
Then what do you do with that? If he's already super popular, if he's weathered the storm, and if New York's objectively doing better than other states, isn't it? This is where it gets even philosophical.
It's going to be handled in an election at that point.
Well, it will be, but this is where it gets even slightly philosophical. It reminds me of the Trump thing. People despise Trump's character, and some of his supporters did, I'm sure, too. And yet, many voted for him because they thought he would be an effective leader,
right?
For whatever reason, whether they're right or wrong. That's the thing. Same thing with Cuomo, of course, right? So would people be willing to do that? And I think clearly, the answer is in some cases yes, very obviously.
I mean, you can have a person with all sorts of, let's say, character defects, but are exceptional at doing the job. And at that point, do you take the guy out from doing the job because of the character defects? This is the Bill Clinton conversation, right? Where Bill Clinton gets caught with Monica Lewinsky. There were others, apparently. But let's go to the Lewinsky thing. And it was like, well, he cheated on his wife. Okay. But is he an effective president? And is the fact that he cheated on his wife, should that somehow undercut him being president?
Because he's just supposed to be our leader, right? I don't care what he does in the bedroom. I don't care if he's a psychopath, serial killer, if he saves more lives than he destroys. I've been watching Hannibal, the TV series recently, so I'm slightly persuaded.
But what if he's inappropriately, I want to get you on the laps. Like saying some weird stuff like that.
As long as we only hear about it occasionally, then I guess most people would be willing to go along with that.
What about the staff? The abuse that the staff takes? And that's the other part. Is the staff taking abuse, or is it the people who came in weren't accustomed to the company culture? Or is the company culture just misogynistic? And it's like all that stuff gets a little strange.
And to be realistic about this, it's not like Cuomo's supporters are going to be like, well, he's a terrible guy, but I love him anyway. That's not it. What they see is
he's a good leader.
For years, he's been a good leader. For years, he's been such an effective leader that his opponents, who simply want to destroy him and replace him, to fill his seat with their own buttocks, that they are going after him relentlessly. And that's why you've seen these investigations, and that all of this stuff was trumped up because because COVID, basically that COVID came along. Everybody handled it poorly. But now everybody's hitting Cuomo. You know what I mean? You could paint it. I can put on my lawyer hat and paint a case from that perspective, just try to get in their mind.
Trying to go after him.
You know what I mean? Yeah, they're trying to go after him, and this is a big old crackdown, and we should stand by him. Well,
they're out to get him, all of them.
Yes, that would be the claim, I guess. I
mean, I saw the video of him at the party.
You know how men can be, Jamarl. You combine like a couple of different threads, and you don't need to think about it that clearly, but those things can sort of mesh together in the back of your mind.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, people can convince themselves of all sorts of things. And again, I am in the mindset that if Cuomo gets out of this, because it could be inappropriate, but it might not be criminal. I mean, it could be that, where it's this, all right, all of this stuff was inappropriate. He shouldn't have done any of it. And yet, it doesn't meet the bar.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting part, I think, is going to be with the deaths in the nursing homes. That part is going to get interesting. And whether they do anything for that or not, because it is a flat fact that he was definitely hiding those numbers.
Yeah, because you know what? It's easy, and even this is super cynical to say, whatever. It's super easy to dismiss. It's getting less easy, thankfully, to dismiss like a woman who brings up the sexual harassment stuff as like, oh, she's just trying to climb up the ladder or something like that. You can dismiss that kind of thing. I'm not saying it's effective or morally good, but I'm saying that's dismissible. People do that kind of thing.
Yeah.
How do you dismiss a grandma dying? If you get interviews, I'm not kidding, if you get interviews with the family members of the thousands of grandmothers who were inappropriately shuffled from the hospital to a nursing home, from nursing home to hospital and back into the nursing home before they had time to fully recover from COVID, which is a large part of the scandal, by the way. You get more people dying. You get the family members coming out. How do you dismiss? Is the dead grandma trying to climb the ladder?
Yeah,
no, very clearly.
Absolutely. And why did he hide it?
Why did he hide it?
It's that part. How do you answer that?
Why was AIDS? Why was the news story that his AIDS came out
Rosa,
and told Democrats, top Democrats, that we dropped the ball on this one, we froze, and again that they hid these numbers.
Yes, Trump said, "What's the numbers in New York?" And they froze. And it's like, we don't want to let those numbers go because those numbers look bad. Those numbers look horrible. And the wild part is, if you would have just came clean with the numbers, everybody was doing bad. Like, so it wasn't like, oh, Cuomo is going to get hit in some kind of legal sense for screwing up in New York. That wasn't it. He just didn't want to look as bad as he looked. And so, yeah, I mean, the catch is that illegal? That's the question. And then even the question of whether or not he was doing it for the book deal. Even that comes up.
Yes.
Because he was getting a book deal at the time when he was, the competent one in the room.
Oh gosh, we've said this stuff so many times. We were talking about this pretty damn consistently, diligently, and effectively. I think
in
advance of all this news coming out. Yeah. That's the thing. Oftentimes we'll get to these stories kind of early, and so we'll have these conversations, have already had them, and be like, oh, we've already had those conversations. When I don't know, but with this specifically, there was so much going on. He got an Emmy award.
Yeah.
He sold a best-selling book because of his COVID leadership. And then it turns out that he hid that he got potentially a lot more people killed, old people killed, by moving them again from a place where they're likely to
put them in a nursing home.
Keep moving them from the hospital back to the nursing home, not without knowing that they had fully recovered from COVID-19.
Exactly. Wouldn't even allow the test.
It's a massive scandal, and who knows what else they might have picked up iatrogenically from the hospital, contracted in there, and brought it back. I'm not trying to make this hyperbolic. My point is, that's a big deal. After he gets an Emmy and writes a best-selling book. This was all floating around last summer, and so that's what sets this scandal up. And if we don't bring that back to contextualize it, it's easy to forget just what is going on here, the whole story, because it's shocking.
Because it gets vague after a while. And it's like the reality of it is, no, he put people in a nursing home. He told them not to do testing, and then goose the numbers to make himself look better than he did. And as he's, showing himself as the competent leadership, as he's doing his things every other day where he's talking about the numbers and everything else, he was doing those announcements. The numbers were being juiced. So, yeah, we'll see. I mean, the investigation is taking place. We'll see how it comes out.
Let's close this out. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, coming back in our soapbox segment with Jamarl's monologue and a possible short back and forth. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share this audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I've been turning something around in my head, and I'm not even quite entirely sure my final thought on it, but I definitely necessarily I want to start on it. It was something that we talked about the other day, and it bothered me greatly because oftentimes what I do, or I find myself having lived through some of these experiences that give me a certain point of view. And oftentimes that point of view is just belligerence. I have watched our government disperse billions of dollars, maybe even trillions at this point. And you look and say, okay, well, what did they spend it on? And did the money that was allocated get spent in the way that it was supposed to be spent for the betterment of the country? Now, what it seems to happen is when it comes to tax cuts, no issue. When you're giving money to the wealthy, no issue. If it's a company that is trying to get his hands on some kind of business, if it's a Bezos or a Musk or something, no issue. No issue. We have nailed it down to a science, getting money into the hands of the wealthy. The catch becomes when it's time to give money to the poor or to the middle class or to some way give back. And at that point, it becomes this difficult prospect, this impossible mission. And even when the money is allocated, the money is still typically just taken by people who don't need it. Let's think back for the moment to Obama and the housing crisis. And we have a situation where the market basically collapses. Obama gets in office, and you have all of these people who are in dire straits for home ownership. Obama put together something called HAMP. Now, the HAMP, Home Affordable Modification Program, Obama saved the banks, but what about the regular person? What about the people who voted for him? Hope and change, hope and change. What about those guys who went out there for him? Right here. HAMP's failure stemmed from its design. Rather than a cash transfer program that handed vouchers to distressed borrowers so they can lower their mortgage payments, the government gives money to mortgage servicing companies to encourage them to modify the loans. Now, this gets to what Mark Frost was talking about yesterday, this notion that instead of just saying, here, crackhead Bob, take the money to do whatever you need to do, we put all of these restrictions and everything in place that make it basically impossible for anybody to use the program. So right here, servicers make their money from the percentage of unpaid principal balance on the loan. Forgiving principal, the most successful type of loan modification, eats into the servicer's profit, so they shy away from that, opting to effectively, for less effective interest rates cut. Meaning that the people who Obama put in charge of this was incentivized not to give the person the best option. They were incentivized to basically screw the person over. With servicers in control of the modification, they can manipulate the program to pile more bad debt on borrowers and squeeze a few extra payments out before foreclosing. Servicers chronically lost borrowers' income documents to extend the default period. The prolonged trial modifications well past 3 months so they could rack up late fees. They granted modifications that folded servicer fees into principal of the loan, increasing the unpaid principal balance and thus their profits, while pushing the borrower further underwater. This was Obama's plan. So while the banks were rescued, And while Obama did everything they could, I'm the one who's between you and the pitchforks. From the standpoint of the borrowers, they went belly up. They went bust. You have a program where billions was dumped into. The banks made a fine. The homeowners, nobody cared. Nobody cared. And so they just got screwed. Even when you get into Trump with the PPP loans, you have a situation where all of that money was put for the PPP loans right here. Over 25 PPP loans worth more than $3.6 million were given to businesses with addresses at Trump and Kushner's estate. The loans to businesses located at, right here, a company called LB City, which is located in Kushner's Bungalow Hotel in Long Beach, New Jersey, received $505,000, meaning the majority of the money that was supposed to go to small businesses ends up going, in large part, to big businesses. So you have money, the money is allocated, great. The money that's allocated, instead of going to where it's supposed to go to help the economy, help the small businesses, that money goes to the top. It's astonishing. It's just when it comes to helping the poor or the middle class, it just seems to be mission impossible. I mean, the same thing with this, with the homeless thing. Just 12% of the money for rental aid has been dispersed. And you have all of these people over the course of the next month or so that are going to be kicked out of their homes, and some people that are already through the process of this. It's an aggravating thing. We're going to bring somebody on to talk about public policy, government policy, and how this stuff works in practice and the mechanisms for all of this stuff. But it is an aggravating thing for me to know family, to know friends. If I was younger and if my mom was going through this when she was raising me, it is very possible that she would be one of these people that needed a house, or she would have been one of those people that was left in the lurch from their jobs. I'm making the point that there are real people at the end of this, and it doesn't necessarily seem that the government cares. Perhaps when you have $100 million in the bank like Nancy Pelosi, this stuff doesn't matter that much. Perhaps when all of the people in Congress, for the most part, are people of means, then they don't quite get what it means to be without means during conditions like this. All of the money that has been allocated, and for whatever reason, they can't seem to spend it. Or when they do spend it, it seems to end up in the hands of people who don't necessarily need it. This is very aggravating to watch and to cover the news, and you think to yourself, why do you guys keep screwing this up? How is it possible that you can't get the most basic of basic things right? The point of government is representing the interests of the public to keep a stable society of sorts. And yet, one issue after the next that doesn't seem to be ability to succeed. I mean, even the vaccination program. The information came out that the CDC was pushing Biden to take a different policy than what Biden was taking. And so it's like, so even the vaccination program, even that doesn't work right. It's very aggravating, and I don't quite know how to place this. And we're probably going to get somebody on for public policy and that type of stuff to figure out how this works from the standpoint of the mechanics of it and why this went wrong. But as somebody who's just watching this and just want the government to succeed at things where people are on the bad ends of it and to watch them fail, it is an aggravating process. Shane, what's your thoughts? I don't entirely know how to place this. I just know it's aggravating to me because it's like they're real people who needed that money. They're real people. Because think about it for the moment. If you are a renter and you, through no fault of your own, lose your job, or let's say have a difficult time getting back to your job because of COVID and everything else, and month after month, you don't know if this is going to be the month where they finally push through the eviction. You don't know if this is going to be the month where you and your kid are going to have to find somewhere else to go. Like month after month, you're stuck with this notion of question, of insecurity. That is not a good place to be. And instead of them just dealing with it through an issue of law, they just let it ride. And then they blamed each other. Like Pelosi says, well, Biden needs to do something. Biden says, well, Pelosi needs to do something. And everybody's looking at each other, pointing fingers. And it's like, I don't care about your finger pointing. I care that you massively failed like 10, 12 million people who basically have no idea where they're going to be living for the next few months. This is just an aggravating thing. That's all. What are your thoughts?
Debt is one of those deeply, what we're talking about fundamentally here is debt and the moral guilt and all this, different sides of it. Mm-hmm. But the psychological stuff that comes with being in debt or being, somebody to whom debts are owed.
Yeah. Because it feels like it feels like It always feels like it's a factor of you, not a factor of the society.
Yeah, and so there are a couple of weird, almost, we don't have much time, so I'll be brief. David Graeber, his book, Debt, The First 5,000 Years, is the one that I always go back to on this because it was the one that most affected my outlook on these things. It's a long book, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that everybody read it, but if it's the kind of thing you're interested in, go check it out. The late David Graeber. He goes over the history of debt, but he focuses particularly on the psychology of debt and how it works sociologically, what its role is for human beings. This, if I do you favors, if I give you gifts, for instance, you feel slightly not indebted to me is the wrong word, but
I feel like something is owed to you.
A desire to reciprocate, and it doesn't need to feel at all negative. In fact, what he argues is that is the very structure or texture or composition of. That's the moral fabric of society. Yeah. People doing each other favors, giving each other gifts, asking each other for favors and gifts.
Am I my brother's keeper?
And this kind of, reciprocal, like back and forth equilibrium thing that we develop and that develops civilization and us in the process. That's his argument. Now, what happens is you create money, you create systems of debt, you create systems for instance of interest. There's an interesting history there with animal husbandry and where interest comes from with, sheep and goats repopulating and interest matching that. Weird tangent. My point fundamentally is, if you look at what debt is and what it does to somebody psychologically, when you are indebted to somebody and there is no practical way for you to pay them back, or it costs you your life to pay them back, what does that do to you? Even though a bank is not a moral agent in some sense, it's just acting personally, purely out of self-interest by giving you whatever money it's giving you because it expects that you're going to pay it back. Right. There is a moral weight that comes to it where it's like a person helping you, a person helping you in a very deep way, which is why when we talk about, for instance, who gets bailed out, moral hazard, that argument gets brought up and it applies to the people who are taking the loans, not the people giving the loans out, even though technically they're both engaging in risky behavior. And if the banks get bailed out, then you can in some sense say, well, hey, they made a bad decision. Why is the moral seesaw perpetually tilted in one direction with the debtor being in the inferior position when in some sense they're both parties to this agreement? That gets into a weird thing. And here's the other side of it. Well, he starts the book out. Shouldn't you always pay your debts, though? He's talking to somebody, having a long conversation with them, talking about debt, the nature of it, and he's kind of critical of it. And they're like, but shouldn't you pay your debts? Are you just saying these people shouldn't owe their debts?
Yeah, so this fair debt?
The real deep moral weight of that, it's like if you don't pay your debts back, you're a bad person on that level of it. The problem is, I get that argument, but if the people who are in a position to put you in debt, the people you need, who's the banks whose help you need to buy a home, or heck, your lord in a fiefdom. There are these different ways of looking at the debts that you owe to people. If they use that position of power that they have over you, the differential that allows them to be the person that you're going into debt to, that puts them in that superior position in the first place, it creates this perpetual hierarchy, this self-perpetuating hierarchy where the people on the bottom blame themselves for being on the bottom. And that's truly ugly and bad, and that's why those things should be kept well within balance. Yeah. But I just felt it was necessary to go into that brief little...
it's hard to get that across. The people who are at the bottom do feel like it's them. It feels like they've done something wrong. And I'm saying this from my own personal experience with my mom. Yeah. Where you could see her like in depression and all of this other stuff. And it wasn't like she wasn't working. She worked every day of her life. She just, from the standpoint of measurements and those things, that stuff just wasn't available. And so it's the person takes it as, it's my fault. I've done something wrong. There's something morally wrong with me in this mix, in this process. And it's not like you've done nothing wrong. It's like she owed money. And like Mark said, the biggest indicator of whether or not somebody was going to be in poverty is whether they came out of poverty. And so it's like you have this kind of weird system that perpetuates itself, that maintains this kind of debtdom.
Yeah, and then blaming yourself for being in the downward position, blaming yourself for being supine perpetually, when in reality, it often is other people that help to put you there. Yeah. You're either dealt a bad hand, or they continually deal them to you because the house is stacked against you, which is sadly often the case. There's no reason, keeping up illusions about this. On the other hand, of course, personal responsibility and accountability are extremely healthy antidotes.
Because I remember I've known people who would get it's like, oh, I'm going to get a TV, I'm going to get all this stuff. And it's like you're buying all of this stuff from one of these rental places. And it's like, they're screwing you over. You don't need the TV. Why are you buying that garbage? It's like that comes into this personal responsibility. Needing a car is a little different. Or needing an apartment. Or needing a degree. Those things get different to me. That becomes more of a, okay, your society is kind of screwing you over with that stuff. Especially with medical bills. And you look at other countries and other societies that says, okay, we need to cover this for the population itself. The public will still have bills. The public will still have stuff that they're going to have to cover. But at the very least for that, deal with it. I mean, different societies, right?
I'm down to close.
Yeah.
I've said my piece on this one. It's a complicated issue, and we're going to come back to it for sure as this unfolds. We're going into a break, though. We'll be coming back with Alan McLeod. He's a senior staff writer for Mint Press News and the author of 2 books. We'll be telling you about those and getting into our conversation on Hong Kong and a lot more when we come back with Alan. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We're joined for this segment with Alan McLeod. Alan McLeod is a senior staff writer for Mint Press News and author of 2 books, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News, and Misreporting and Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. Alan, thank you for joining us.
Good to be with you. How are you?
I'm doing all right. I saw a tweet that you put out that I wanted to hit. And it basically says, Hong Kong court case or Hong Kong court convicts man over slogan chanted by thousands. All right. Then it's like, whoa, Hong Kong did that? I mean, that sounds pretty rough. I mean, China is, horrible. And then you go further. The waiter, who has been held without bail for more than a year, has pleaded not guilty over his actions at a protest in 2020 when he drove a motorcycle with a flag bearing the protest slogan, quote, liberate Hong Kong, revolution of our times, unquote, into a group of police. The incident occurs hours after the law was enacted and police declared that slogan banned. It's not about the slogan. It's about the guy riding his bike into a bunch of cops, right?
Exactly. It's incredible that media is presenting it like that. Now, obviously, you can support Hong Kong protests, you can oppose them, but, I think at least we have to have some sort of basis of reality when we're talking about it. And unfortunately, that Bloomberg article is an example of a wider trend where news about China comes through a distorted prism, which is all about trying to present it as a danger, a threat, or somehow bad. And this is just the latest case of that.
Yeah, it seems to be the standard going forward. I'm curious, from your standpoint, when you're looking at the media and you're looking at this, it seems to correlate to government point of view. Like the moment that the government takes a dim point of view towards a particular country, it seems that media also takes a dim point of view to the country. And so when, it's like China is now an adversary, it's now a threat. And so when the media or news comes out, it comes out within this kind of weird threat lens also. Have you noticed the correlation between the two? And do you think there's a direct push? Or do you think this is something that media is just doing almost instinctually? How does these two things relate to one another, if that makes sense?
It's structural, really. I mean, us in media studies, we talk about, the theories behind it. And Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman wrote a great book called Manufacturing Consent, where they laid out how media always serve the elite of a certain country, whichever country they're in. And right now, there's pretty much bipartisan consensus that China is the threat to the United States. People are seeing its economy booming, its economy growing, and people in Washington are getting kind of nervous about how powerful China is getting. And so suddenly in the last few years, we've seen just a slew of negative coverage about China. And unfortunately, because media are essentially, they have the same structure, they're owned by corporations, they're owned by billionaires. None of it's really like publicly funded, or none of it's funded by listeners or viewers, we have pretty much the same kind of standard coverage, regardless of where you go in corporate media.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, because it's hard to know what's real when that stuff comes through, because it's unclear in regards to the spin that they put on it. I mean, and it's not just China. I mean, they do the same thing with Iran. They would say something like, Iran proxy groups are in, let's say, a particular country. And then as you read down in the article, you find out it's unclear on whether or not these groups are associated and affiliated with Iran. It is very aggravating. It's like you have to read the entire story just to get the basics of the details of it. From your book, though, 20 years of fake news and misreporting and propaganda in the information age, still manufacturing consent. When all of this information comes out, saying fake news and saying we have to stop people from on various media networks and social media, can you make an association between the fake news or the manufacturing consent over the course of all of these years that the public at a certain point starts to realize that that's what's taking place? And the public, let's say, disenchantment with information from either the political space or the media space. Those things I consider to be related to one another. Meaning if you keep telling the public, or if you lie to the public enough, the public gets to the point where the public thinks you're lying to it. And the things that you're telling it that is true, the public has a hard time knowing what's what. I guess I'm trying to make the point, or you elaborate on this idea of, let's say, fake news, and then real news that is considered fake by the public.
Yeah, we are in a crisis of credibility, not just in media, but in our institutions and in each other as well. For a good 6-7 years, well, in fact, actually for decades, but particularly in the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen public confidence in media descending very rapidly. And this has huge effects, negative ones for the most part, on our society. I think we have to really get away from the idea that fake news is purely the realm of some Macedonian blogger on Facebook, because ultimately, when we talk about fake news, what were the most damaging pieces of false information of this century? I mean, surely it was the WMD in Iraq scandal, which led to, 1 million people dying, millions of people losing their homes, an entire region of the planet destroyed. And who was pushing that? Was it bloggers? No, it was big outlets like the New York Times and CNN, who are now presenting themselves as the sole champions of truth and honesty and credibility in this media landscape, and are actually the ones who are pushing for more censorship of alternative news or differing opinions, whether that's on social media, online, or in the general press sphere itself. So we've got this crazy situation where the people who have actually perpetrated the most damaging lies and falsehoods of this century are the ones who are now really in the driver's seat when it comes to deciding what kind of media landscape we have. And this is all being done under the guise of fake news. It's incredible.
I mean, and in some sense, thank you for joining us, by the way, Alan. In some sense, this is driven by and also causing a deeper social change. It's not just in propaganda. It's like a change in what's politically possible in our society or something like that. 20th century propaganda looked like radio and TV. 21st century propaganda looks like something completely different. And whether it's coming directly from the state, which, you know, when I use the term propaganda, usually I'm referring to state or state-like actors releasing information, that kind of thing. Whether it's coming directly from the state or it's being released through proxies, or there's this weird call and response between these different and increasingly fragmented, apparently, you know, communities online, driven by the internet. That's a sort of deeper social change and a deeper political change. It changes what's possible, I would argue, politically in a society. In other words, if it's harder to rally people around ideas, if you don't have one set of establishment outlets that you can use, and instead what you're left with is a sort of insurgent informational landscape kind of thing, where you're constantly having to deal with these unpredictable domains. That is far afield from journalism, though, which I want to come back to for a minute here. Looking at this situation as a journalist, how do you, I'll start with it very simple. How do you personally try to deduce what's true? How do you get, you know, away from that? I mean, I guess my reason in asking that is it's a kind of confusing morass. We don't have a way to define the new paradigm that we're in, but I'd argue that it's paradigmatic. It's fundamentally different from what came before, which means I think it's helpful to come back to sort of first principles. Like, you know, how do I know what's true? That kind of thing. So for you, Alan, looking at this landscape, thinking as somebody who's trying very hard to figure out what's true. How do you do that? What's your job like these days?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess for news consumers, if you're just kind of like going out there without any kind of theoretical background, it can just be like news hitting you all the time, 24/7, and there's no way to really process what you're thinking about. So I would definitely recommend people try to read about the structure of the media and the political economy of it. I would recommend the book Manufacturing Consent, or Inventing Reality by Michael Parenti, or any of Robert McChesney's work. On a sort of thing that you can do immediately, though, I always recommend that people should get their news from a multitude of different sources, and if possible, get it from different countries as well. There's a lot of outlets around the world that publish in English now. You can get it from, Al Jazeera or CGTN or Telesur or BBC or RT or anything like that, and read it in combination with what's going on in the media that you do consume. And the reason you do that is you'll see how different places frame different issues, and very often it's completely the opposite. You'll come away with a completely different understanding of what's going on. And that way you can kind of triangulate people's biases very well. If you don't do that, you might just be swimming in the sea and never really realize the sort of propaganda you're under. There's a great quote that, I think it was Bertolt Brecht said that, I don't know who discovered water, but I'm willing to bet it wasn't the fish. And what he meant is that the fish is just surrounded by water all the time, and so it's just normal to them. And so it's only really when you start looking at other places for media, for instance, that you start thinking, oh, hey, maybe our media isn't quite as unbiased and telling us the entirety of the situation on its own. And the last thing I'd say is probably a good thing to do is get media from outlets that are funded in different ways. So I think right now, listener-supported media or viewer-supported media is a very good way to go. These sorts of small outlets are not under the same sort of pressures from bosses or from advertisers, or sometimes even from governments, that other media outlets are under. And so again, they will report the news in a different way. And they might be reporting it in a way which you might think is more aligned with your views, and you might think is more fruitful and just in generally better for society.
And it sounds like the common thread there, we're going to go to a break here, is a diversity of sources. In other words, if you can, it's like finding the contradictions, it's finding the water. If you can find places where you self-induce a little bit of cognitive dissonance and you're like, wait, what's actually going on here? I see two competing claims, each saying something that contradicts the other. What is the truth there? That's like a thorn that gets in your side. That kind of thing, I think, pushes people on these larger paths of discovery that they, will often break them free of whatever sort of informational morass they're in. We're going into a break, joined by Alan McLeod. He's senior staff writer for Mint Press News and the author of 2 books, Bad News from Venezuela, 20 Years of Fake News and Misreporting, and Propaganda in the Information Age, Still Manufacturing Consent. Again, a nod to the Chomsky classic title. We're going into a break. We'll be back with Alan McLeod on the other side. Coming right back.
Fault lines.
You check top.
We couldn't put it better ourselves. Tune in to Political Misfits on Mondays at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Miss the Press, our weekly takedown of Sunday's toothless news talk shows.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Recently, Craig Murray, this is, I believe, the Uzbekistan, he is the former diplomat, if I'm not mistaken, for Uzbekistan, if I'm not mistaken, for the UK. He has been put in, what was that? Say it one more time.
Just a little bit of an echo.
Oh, okay, there's an echo. But basically, he's been put in prison, and he's going to be there apparently for 8 months. You also have whistleblower Daniel Hale, who is going to be put in prison apparently also. And Daniel Hale is a whistleblower who basically revealed the drone program. Alan, you wrote an article on this from It Press, or I guess you gave a commentary back and forth on this, discussing this. What is your take on this? I mean, you basically have Craig Murray, who is an annoyance to the UK, and they're putting him in prison on something that they've never put anybody in prison on before. So there's that. And then you have Hale, who is a whistleblower, and who Democrats kept saying, we must protect the noble whistleblower. Oh, right, but that was under Trump. But when you got into this thing of bringing up programs and systems that are almost somewhat ingrained and that are not hitting on something that is basically trivial, well, then they put those people in prison. And here we have two cases, one in the U.S. and one in the UK. What is your take on this? I saw you write an article about this.
Yeah, I think the implications for this are very worrying, especially for press freedom and an open, free society. One thing I'd say about Craig Murray is that he was a close associate of Julian Assange.
That's right.
He was blogging about the trial of the former First Minister of Scotland, Alex Salmond, who was later acquitted. What he said in his blogs, the prosecution said that although he didn't reveal the names of the people accusing Mr. Salmond of, I think it was sexual assault,
yeah,
the information he gave out about their identities, if put together with other parts of information that were out there on the web, could be used to actually identify these women.
It's a jigsaw.
And that's basically like saying, yeah, he gave one part of the jigsaw. That's very worrying because nobody says that he actually doxed them and gave out their identities, just that he gave some information that could be used. That is quite a worrying precedent. Whether you think, I mean, I'm not sure if Craig Murray should have put that information out there or he shouldn't, but the fact that he's being charged under this is very worrying, considering the sort of things that us journalists say all the time about, his accuser is a 26-year-old woman or something. Would that be enough to potentially land you in court later on? And with regards to Hale, I think that's even more egregious, where Hale was really exposing details of U.S. war crimes in the Middle East. And yet, while he's being sent to jail, the people who are ordering these war crimes and carrying them out, they remain completely free. And so ultimately, both of these people are thorns in the side of empire. And if they were, pushing narratives which actually helped the UK and US states, they wouldn't be getting treated like this. And so that's very worrying. And it's also kind of busts any holes in the idea that the US and UK are these bastions of free speech and everyone around the world looks up to us and thinks we're the bee's knees.
Yeah. And just to be clear, it was a British ambassador to Uzbekistan.
Exactly, like you said. And on Craig Murray, I want to talk about the Alex Salmond thing for a second, but just briefly. Journalistically, it would be quite difficult if I'm thinking, okay, am I going to be sued for potentially revealing one piece of a larger puzzle that, in Unity would reveal a picture of, the source or this a person? It would give something away that would be illegal. Journalistically, this puts you on a very, very, very weird, fine ground, shaky ice, that kind of thing, where you don't, I think you understand where I'm coming from with this, Alan. You don't know exactly what you can say, which from a journalistic perspective is pretty damning on your ability to just factually report stories. Whether you're trying to reveal something, whether you do reveal something or not, being charged on the potential that, somebody might fit whatever you release into a narrative that, that they can use in some way. I think you get my point. How do you operate with that? And this is, when we were talking about this a little while back, this seemed like a more British issue or at least a less American issue. It seems like we have stronger protections on this kind of thing. I remember talking with Alexander Mercouris about this, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he was saying this is much more likely to happen in the UK than it is in the US. Still worrying from this side of the pond, but two questions here. One, how does that affect, how can you imagine that affecting journalistically what you're allowed to report? How can you navigate that or guess that? And then two, do you think this is actually going to be a precedent? Do you think this is going to be a recurring problem that will be brought to bear on other journalists, operating in opposition like Craig Murray is in the future in the UK? Alan, what's your take?
Well, if you're asking me if journalists will be a lot less bold in covering sensitive issues regarding the state, I mean, of course, they're going to be treading on thin ice as if it could break at any point. So Whether this actually is a precedent or not, well, that remains to be seen. But the fact that this is out there, it already plants that information in journalists' minds, which means that people who might take a more critical stance towards government issues or issues towards national security, they've already heard that warning shot. And so they are probably going to be more cowed than before. And that's the point. This is a classic case of flack where the government puts up barriers towards you reporting on things that maybe you shouldn't know. So ultimately, yeah, I think this is a very dangerous time. So many of the laws we have in the UK and also in the US, they're on the books. They almost never they're never actually pushed upon. But perhaps in the future, if things change, security forces can go back to them and say, well, they're on the books, we're going to enforce them now. And that's the real worry.
Well, yes, because basically they're using it selectively to go after who they want. I mean, what would be the reason? Is it just the Julian Assange issue that you think they're going after him for this? I mean, this is kind of, well, it was a judge that did it. Would the judge be affected by political wins, if that makes sense?
Well, I'm not sure exactly why, but I would say that if Craig Murray was still a British ambassador and he was behaving himself in the eyes of Westminster or of London, I don't think this would have happened to him ultimately. I mean, we saw let's jump over the Atlantic, we saw in the US when General David Petraeus revealed all of these saucy, salacious secrets, these documents to his lover so she could write a better book. What happened to him? Was he thrown in jail and the key, chucked in the rubbish? No, he's still out there. So ultimately, there's kind of a one rule for some and another rule for other people. And yeah, so ultimately, this could be used as a precedent to go after whistleblowers, to go after critical journalists. And ultimately, this is creating a much more fearful media environment, and that's not good for anyone, except those in Washington. And
I think it would be worthwhile just to repeat, Craig Murray, what was the Alex Salmond case? What was its political significance? Not just in terms of, okay, Alex Salmond will either, be charged and potentially drawn under, but like a wider geopolitical significance. Who is Alex Salmond in Scottish politics? Why was the case against him important? And, what was Craig Murray doing politically? Why was he sort of putting himself at risk by reporting on that case? Alan?
Well, the Scottish National Party is the dominant party in Scotland. Alex Salmond was the First Minister for a number of years. So you could say he's the most powerful man in Scotland. But the party really split along two lines. And Alex Salmond was accused of all of these sexual crimes. He was actually acquitted of all of them in court. But certainly the rumours linger on. And so ultimately he's being kicked out of the party he led. And he's sort of seen as a persona non grata. He started his own party, hasn't gone nearly as well as the Scottish National Party. But Craig Murray was one of his most prominent defenders from these allegations. And so ultimately, I think, do you want to jump in?
Well, sorry, no, I was keeping on in this vein. What was the division, the nature of the division? Alex Salmond creating a breakaway party, from the party that he founded. Who was he? What was he pushing for? Why did Craig Murray side with him? Again, kind of returning to some of the geopolitical implications or just the direction of the country. Why? Yeah, carrying on with that. Where did Alex Salmond take the party? Why was he a threat himself? Alan?
Well, I'm not sure if I'd say he's a threat. I don't think anybody in Westminster thought he was a threat to national security or anything. But certainly under his reign, the SNP, the Scottish National Party, jumped from being a reasonably large party to becoming absolutely dominant in Scottish politics, winning virtually every seat in the entire country for the British Parliament. And that meant that he could push forward with an independence referendum, which ultimately lost 45 to 55. But despite losing that, it feels like the momentum is still accelerating towards independence, even without Salmond at the helm of the SNP. Now Nicola Sturgeon is a party leader. And so, yes, ultimately, I think for people in London, it is very worrying to see this happening in Scotland because they do not want to see the breakup of the UK, because if Scotland leaves, suddenly the question of Northern Ireland and Wales will become much more salient. And already we see in Northern Ireland there's a majority of people who want to leave the Union.
That's kind of where I wanted to go with it. And I'm glad that you brought us there, Alan. But I also, I wanted to see where you would take us. That's what I was thinking as well, though. Nicola Sturgeon, it's not just power politics. It's not just her trying to kick out the former leader or something like that and reassert herself, consolidate power. It's the Scottish independence issue. Alan McLeod, great conversation. Thank you for joining us. Senior staff writer from Press News and author. Go check his work out. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back with headlines on the other side of this short break.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That would strongly imply that you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news, about 135,811 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, and there were about 454 deaths. Over the past week, there's been an average of 85,866 cases per day, an increase of 142% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 50% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 58% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 35,175,455 people across the United States and has killed 613,436 people. Haven't seen this high of a single-day caseload since the beginning of February, near the peak of winter sickness season. Yes, that's right. I mean, we're getting back to old numbers.
We are. And I put that in at the end there, my little flavor text.
Yeah.
Because if you look at a chart, it's true. There is like a massive mountain peak over cold and flu season, and it goes down pretty steeply. You wouldn't want to ski down that thing.
Yeah.
Or it would be really fun if you did. And then it goes back up. And again, we're just starting on the back upswing, but the 130,000 new cases in a single day, we haven't seen that since, I think, February 3rd, something like that, 6 months ago.
Wow.
Not going well.
And here's another one. Biden has reached his July 4th vaccination goal today. 70% of American adults are vaccinated. Is that right? 70%?
Yes. That is the goal. That was the July 4th goal.
Well, it says 50% of total American public.
That's the total American public, then 70% of adults. That's where I've had to explain this a couple times before.
70%? Oh, I see.
You see. There are more Americans than there are adults because of kids.
Okay, fair enough.
Fair enough.
I was like, wait a minute.
Hang on a second.
Yeah.
No, but that's the deal.
Yeah. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo was grilled by 2 officials investigating allegations of sexual assault against him. For about 11 hours, Cuomo was videotaped while being interviewed by June H. Kim and Ann L. Clark, who were appointed by New York Attorney General Letitia James. The interview followed months of interviews with former and current aides to Cuomo who have accused him of sexual assault or sexual harassment. During the interview, Cuomo reportedly suggested that Kim had an axe to grind with him after Kim investigated Cuomo's shutdown of an anti-corruption panel in 2014. I remember that. Yeah, I remember that. The District of Columbia's police department has stated that 2 more officers who responded to January 6th riot have committed suicide. This brings the total of suicide by officers, or total cops who committed suicide, who responded to the event, to 4. Wow. Ukrainian police are investigating the murder of a Belarusian dissident and activist who organized a house for exiles from Belarus and Ukraine. After the man was reported missing, he was found hanged with a broken nose. At least 40 Afghani civilians have been killed in the last day as fierce fighting is ongoing between Taliban and the government forces over the province of Helmand. Thousands of Kandahar and Lashkar have been displaced. China is set to test the entire population of Wuhan for coronavirus cases as their count ramps up in the country. Authorities have attributed the increased spread to the raging Delta variant. Simone Biles competed in the balance beam event yesterday and took bronze. Biles was seated in 7th but jumped to a 3rd place finish. She lost gold to 16-year-old Chinese sensation Wan Chechen. 2nd place was another Chinese gymnast, Tang Xiang Tag. This was almost certainly the last medal for the 24-year-old Biles, but she is very proud of what she was able to overcome. Belarusian Olympic runner Kristina Simanowskaya, I think I'm pronounced.
Simanowskaya.
There you go. Thank you, Shane. Has been granted a visa from Poland after she was nearly forced to fly home in the middle of the games. Kristina publicly criticized her coaching staff, which sparked a heated debate back home, prompting the regime to crack down on government critics. Kristina was brought to the airport and refused to board, instead approaching police before seeking asylum from the International Olympic Committee and social media. So far, the medal leaders in order are the United States and China, tied with 68, Russian athletes, Great Britain, and Japan. China has the most gold medals with 32, the U.S. follows with 22, followed by Japan with 19. And last, scientists have been able to, I've seen this one. Scientists have been able to see the backside of a black hole for the first time and have proved Einstein's theory of general relativity as correct. The black hole is 55 million light years away, 6.5 billion times the mass of the sun, and bigger than our entire solar system. Using a high-powered X-ray telescope, researchers were able to confirm the massive gravitational pull of the black hole warps the fabric of space, twisting magnetic fields and bending light waves. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Those are your headlines. That one is an interesting one. The bending of space. I guess we knew about that one, but I saw this article a few days ago, and they were basically able to see the back side of the black hole. And it's like, well, wait a minute, how does that work? Well, if you think of space being so warped that you get this kind of gravitational lensing effect. I mean, right now we have a gravitational lensing effect where if you're looking at a star, we shouldn't be able to see it, but because of the warping of space, the scientists can see the light, bend. Light only goes in a straight line, and so the only thing that can be bending is space. From the light's point of view, it's a straight line. From our point of view, it's turning a corner. Very interesting stuff. We need to get somebody on for that also. I was thinking about asking Lo Ave when he was on, but we didn't get the opportunity to get to it.
And specifically, the big part of this that's in the headlines, confirming Einstein's general theory of relativity. The part of that is having to do with black holes warping space-time around them, warping the fabric of this stuff. And then that's where seeing the backside of the thing comes in. And let me tell you, the backside of a black hole is beautiful. I don't really know. I'm just making that up. But
Yeah, the light and all this other stuff.
You theoretically shouldn't be able to see the literal other side of it because it is occluding you. The black hole itself would be preventing your vision of it. But because it's bending, bending the space around it because of the intense gravity, then you're seeing some of the photons some of the X-rays specifically that are emitted.
It's wild stuff.
Some of that
is so wild.
Part of the electromagnetic spectrum.
Yeah, that is so wild.
Yeah.
I love stuff like that. I want to get to 2 more people committed to suicide.
Yeah.
That is, see, the thing is, we don't know why. I mean, when they give the story, it's always assumed that the person committed suicide is in relation to January 6th. Well, we don't know that. It's assumed because of the way the story is framed. So it's like 2 more cops died that were on the January 6th event. Okay. So the link is January 6th. Oh, well, how do we know the link is January 6th? How do we know that they committed suicide because of whatever took place in January 6th? I mean, I get their framing. I get what they're trying to get across to people when they say that story. But I'm curious about the psychology of the people who did it.
Yeah. What was going through their head exactly?
Yeah.
I'm guessing it had something to do with it because,
did it?
The timing. That's what I'm saying. I'm guessing. Which, of course, begs the question, well, what if it didn't? What if it doesn't have anything to do with it? Suicide is pretty high among police officers.
Exactly.
So on the one hand, this is just a sad thing, and you can see it happening. On the other hand, did it have something to do with it? If so, how?
Yeah. Right. Like, were they racked with guilt, which I don't know why they would be. Were they having PTSD, which, again, possibly. But, I mean, was that the thing that ended their life? This is presented as if it's related. And all I'm saying is I don't know that. I don't know that. And I remember them saying that, what's his name, Sicknick died or was killed there with a fire extinguisher and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
And it was
Austin saying suicide is higher in police than in any other profession.
Yeah.
Which sounds about right.
Right. But I guess, was this related to January 6th is the question.
Yes. Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, they're going to frame it that way, but I swear, I don't know. China is going to test the entire population. Wow.
And last I checked, that was with like only hundreds of cases.
Yeah, it wasn't a huge number.
Compared to, but they have a completely different set of standards. That seems to have served them pretty damn well,
Yes, it did.
do say so.
I want to get to Simone Biles. So she finally competes. She comes in third. So what? Balance beam is just not her event. She's supposed to be the greatest of all time, but that's when she's competing in like the floor routine and stuff like that. No, I'm asking because I don't know.
I don't know. All I know is you were, and I'm going to hit you on it a little bit.
Uh-oh.
You're the one who's consistently like, come on, Simone, come on, you got to get back out on that floor.
No, I'm not
Why are you getting off that floor?
No, I guess I'm trying to figure out she's supposed to be the greatest of all time. So when I see her perform, I'm just thinking,
the greatest of all time, Simone. You got bronze. You only got a bronze.
You only got a bronze, yo. You only got a bronze up your game.
Exactly.
No, I didn't. I'm not sure. That's what I'm asking. It's not me having to go at her.
According to Austin, producer Austin, her event is vault, and she's also amazing at floor.
Okay.
So not exactly her.
So this is not her thing.
It's not her thing, and she did get bronze. Yeah. Which, if you take any random group of people and are you gonna get a bronze medal at the Olympics? No, any random person is not. My point is, Simone is like a pretty damn talented athlete.
Not even her event,
and you're like, come on, Simone, why did you have to take a week off? Why are you failing?
Well, the wild part is, it seems like the balance beam will be harder if you think about it. Like if you're thinking about your the twisties and your ability to know where you are, your cognitive awareness in it seems like that's more, appropriate on the balance beam of anything. It seems like that would be
you're up quite a bit higher.
Yeah. Not to mention you can fall.
Exactly.
Hit your head, etc.
The other side of being up higher, speaking of gravity.
So the events that she excelled in, she didn't do. The event that she didn't excel in, she was able to compete. Okay. All right.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, like another theory, and this was kind of the first theory, is just she's just not, forget the twisties. That's a made up concept.
Yeah.
Forget that. She's just stressed, and she was like, people are pushing her too hard.
Yeah.
And so she's like, no, guys, I'm sorry. You put it up too much. I believed you. I shouldn't have believed you with the whole goat thing. And so she just decides to step out. And then the only event that she enters is somehow the one that she would both be at more risk of suffering from the twisties with, and like the one that she's not an expert at. In other words, it's a weird, like, okay, I'll play a little bit in the thing that I'm bad at, so that I can technically say I participated, but have no real skin in the game and won't face the personal pressure. That's my new conspiracy theory about Simone Biles, is that she genuinely just doesn't like the pressure.
Oh man, if that's true, then I greatly dislike her. If that's true, like I can accept, I don't want to fall and hit my head. I can accept that. I can accept the twisties. I can accept mental health. I can accept all that. I can't accept, I just can't take the pressure. That's different. I mean, am I wrong about being too much of a hard butt on this?
I think you're being a little bit too much of a hard butt, because what if, I'm forgetting the dude's name right now, of course, but the football player who refused to kneel, please remind me.
Who refused to kneel?
The football player.
Tebow, maybe?
The football player who, specifically with the national anthem, refused to. It's the well-known football player who refused
to kneel.
Who refused to kneel for the national anthem.
You mean who kneeled for the national anthem?
Oh, pardon me. Thank you. Who kneeled for the national
anthem? Because I was like, what is he talking about?
What's the guy's name?
Sorry. So it was K.
So he's
Kaepernick.
Exactly. Colin Kaepernick. Thank you. He stepped out. Thank you. Also, Austin. He stepped out because of a sort of political reason. Simone Biles stepped out. You can argue it's a political form of expression as well. She doesn't.
Fear.
Well, it's not just fear necessarily.
What is it?
Maybe it's a sense of resentment at the idolization. I'm just spewing nonsense at this point. I'm trying to justify my favorite little theory here.
I mean, look, you could be, I don't think you have to justify the theory. I mean, you could be right where it's like pressure.
The pressure. That was
all
the original
this pressure
theory.
is on me. They're calling me the greatest of all time. They talk about me insecure. They said I'm going to win all these medals. It's just so much pressure. And anything that I do less than that is a failure.
And that's my point, is that she comes up with a perfectly plausible explanation. Okay, the twisties, that sounds not like a made-up word.
It could fall out of the air.
Yeah, twisty sounds real. Of course, I know it's a real thing. Anyway, she comes up with this. It's a very plausible theory. And then the one event that she enters into is like one that doesn't make sense with the twisties, and is no pressure because she's not even that good at it. And yet she still bronzes, which is, it's a testament to her athleticism, to her abilities, I would argue. That's the other thing, man.
Look, I'll be provocative. If you're going to be an athlete, be an athlete. And if you're going to go out there and perform, go out there and perform. And no, I'm not going to applaud you if you turn around and say, okay, I'm not going to perform because I have a mental day. I'm not going to applaud that. And so it's like people are saying they're applauding this. Why would I applaud that? I mean, it's like very proud of what she was able to overcome. What did you overcome?
Yeah, that's the part that I snigger at a little bit.
Yeah, it's like, what did you overcome? And this is what I mean. It's like, should people get applause for basically not doing? And basically, she didn't do. I mean, like, basically, they're applauding her for saying she was strong enough to not compete. It's like, but her job was to compete.
We could have another Olympics when she gets back and just, like, give her a gold medal. To
right.
Make everybody
if you
feel
compete
better.
in your bedroom, I don't think that counts. I mean, like, basically, and look, I know this sounds horrible.
But she already proved herself.
She's gotten her medals and everything else.
Me knowing nothing about gymnastics, other than the women who engage in it are often, attractive or whatever, as a simple man from outside it. Me knowing nothing about it, I'm like, okay, she's still quite young. She's still quite young. Speaking with Emily, I just passed that in, and then I get people correcting me. No, she's not. 24 is actually pretty old for the gymnastics. The point being that she has already made her name. Yeah. She already came in. She already conquered Veni Vici, and now she's out. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That's another way of looking at it, in which she doesn't need your.
She doesn't need my approval.
She doesn't need your approval, your support, any of that. She's a strong woman, Jamarl.
Yeah, she doesn't need my approval. Exactly. This is just how I look at sports and stuff like that. And I don't know. I just, in my head, and I've always had a dual mind on this. And I think you guys have seen that dual mind on the, where it seems like I'm taking shots at her by the same token. I'm like, well, but it makes sense if you're, I don't want to die.
Yeah.
No, as a provocative point of view, if you're an athlete, you need to compete. And if you're going to go there to the Olympics and you're going to take a spot that somebody else could have taken.
That is another side of this.
That would have had the ability to compete, that would have wanted to compete, that would have been hungry to compete, as opposed to you just standing there trying to get some kind of accolades for not competing. Yeah. I'm not applauding this.
I'm not applauding this. I spit on this. No, we're going into a break. To be clear, those were our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines, and we're coming back with Carl Jha talking about the situation in Myanmar as the coup appears to have worked. To be clear, with the Myanmar, the leader of the country, military general, saying that military rule will continue until at least 2023 throughout the entirety of this next year. We're also going to be speaking about China's thorium reactor. Although that I say reactor, I should say reactors, because a lot of what we're talking about is not just, their multiple reactors, but their plans to produce and sell these plants, which is a big deal in the international energy landscape. We'll be speaking about those topics and more with Carl Jha when we come back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is. So definitely don't be shy. We've been trying to get to the Myanmar story for a while, so I am glad that our guest is on with us to have a conversation about it. This is the New York Times. 6 months to the day after Myanmar's military staged a coup and imposed a reign of terror over the country, the junta leader, Senior General Mi Aung Hlaing, said on Sunday that the national state of emergency will be extended for another 2 years. Well, how is he able to make this proclamation? And if making this proclamation is correct, as Shane said, does it mean that the junta has succeeded? To have a conversation, we're joined with Carl Jha. He's host of Silk and Steel podcast focused on China and surrounding regions and their history, culture, and politics. You can follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Jha, follow podcasts on Twitter at Steel, Silk, and subscribe and support the podcast at patreon.com/Silk and Steel. Carl, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me again.
Oh, absolutely. I always enjoy these conversations with you. You always give us something new. So Aung Suu Kyi apparently is still being prosecuted, still in jail. I would imagine there are still pockets of resistance throughout the country with the various groups that are in Myanmar. But the military is basically saying, we are going to basically maintain a state of emergency or military rule for 2023. So they are saying for 2 years, is it over? Has the military won? What is going on in Myanmar?
Yeah, the problem with Myanmar is right now, the Aung San Suu Kyi side don't really have a counter to the military. The military has been ruling the country for decades, and they felt threatened by Aung San Suu Kyi's faction because when Myanmar was back under international sanction, the Myanmar military junta control a large section of the economy. You know, back then they claimed to be socialist, but what happened was all these military junta and their families control a huge chunk of the Myanmar economy. As Myanmar opened up, as a deal worked out between United States and Myanmar military junta to allow Aung San Suu Kyi's Aung San Suu Kyi's government taking power, is that the sanctions were lifted, but as a result, a lot of foreign investment rushed in, and the military junta realized they are losing the grip on the country. Their share of the economy increasingly shrunk, so goes their power base, and that is the primary reason why they did the coup.
Wait, I thought the primary reason they did the coup was because Aung San Suu Kyi was making moves to basically increase her share of power.
Push them out.
Right, to push them out. And in the last election, she took more seats than was constitutionally instilled by the military. But you're saying that it was an economic choice.
It's both. I mean, that is why Aung San Suu Kyi presented such a threat, and the military is willing to remove Aung San Suu Kyi, even at the price of going back to the Myanmar under international sanction. That's where we are right now. I mean, Myanmar military junta had survived under international sanction for decades between 1988 to 2000s. We are returning back to that era right now. There's, more international. I don't think more international sanction is going to change the mind of the juntas.
Well, I think the difference is Aung San Suu Kyi was existential to them, because if she was going to maintain, she was just going to take power. I mean, it really did seem like, looking at and reading over the articles when this was first taking place, it really did seem like she was trying to take power. Like she was making moves in order to undermine the military, hence the military's movement.
And when
Meaning
you say existential, like to push them out of power perpetually, to become a perpetually dominant in
to become
abstract
a
sense.
democracy in a sense, as opposed to having military junta as the underlying thing. Meaning they were trying to get rid of. She was trying to get rid of them. She was trying to make the country into something else. Or tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, well, Aung San Suu Kyi has a lot of popular support. I mean, especially among the Bamar majority in Myanmar. So in that way, yes, I mean, Aung San Suu Kyi's rise to power is a threat to the military because not only she has popular sort of popular mandate, but there's no little love lost between the military junta and Aung San Suu Kyi. I mean, they put her under house arrest for decades. And the only reason Aung San Suu Kyi came back to power is because United States promised to lift the sanctions if the military agreed to a power sharing agreement. But like as you say, what the power sharing agreement ended up being is they see Aung San Suu Kyi's faction is on a path, ascendant path. They're gaining more and more power, and that's why the military felt threatened, and they're willing to go back to a Myanmar under isolation rather than losing the grip of power.
Better to be a big fish in a small pond in some sense than a very small fish in a much larger pond. And again, maybe slightly crass when there's so many lives at stake, but just that idiom, it kind of fit. Would it be okay, Carl, if we take a couple of steps back? We keep bringing up 1988 and the origin of Aung San Suu Kyi, the 888 uprising, which could we get into that? Would you be willing to do that with us?
Sure. So for decades prior to that, Myanmar military assumed power since 1960 coup, and they have maintained power all the way to 1980. So by 1980, that was the first time they allow elections, and to their surprise, their faction lost, and Aung San Suu Kyi's side won a landslide, and then the military refused to recognize the result of the election. They launched a crackdown. There was a student protest, and in the resultant crackdown, many students were killed. So this happened in 1988. As a result, Myanmar was placed under international sanction by the West, and as a result, in the decade between 1988 and 2000, because Myanmar does not have access to international capital from the West, they increasingly come to dependent on its neighbor China, and that became worrisome for United States in 2000 as China start to rise. So in order to wean Myanmar away from China, U.S. made a deal with the military junta in Myanmar that they will lift the international sanction if they agree to a power sharing agreement with Aung San Suu Kyi. So that's how Aung San Suu Kyi came back to power, but only at the sufferance of the military, basically.
Okay, so here's another side of this that I want to get into. 1988, the reason they're called the 8888 protests is it's associated, or the 8888 uprising. It's August 8th, was a big date, August 8th, 1988, where apparently a lot of stuff happened, but it had been going on throughout the year. She sort of rises through that. In 1990, her party, the National League for Democracy, like you say, won that election. The unity refused to recognize it. They put her into house arrest. The United States dropped sanctions on Myanmar. Myanmar turns to China under military rule, and in order to basically bring Myanmar back from the edge, bring them back into the fold, the United States offers to drop those sanctions in exchange for a co-ruling agreement with Aung San Suu Kyi.
Yes.
Good enough so far. We also might do well to bring up her father, Aung San. Can you please tell us about him? Because that would explain her popular support. I mean, another way to put this is she is a random person without explaining it. She's a completely random figure, just a random woman who comes in and is suddenly very popular. Who is her dad? Who was her father in the context of that country?
So Aung San is like the father of modern Myanmar, because Myanmar was a British colony. It was ruled as part of the British India. And Aung San was a Burmese nationalist. He wanted to overthrow the British yoke. And even in the beginning, he wanted to go seek help from Soviet Union. But when he was traveling via China, the Japanese invasion happened, and then he ended up meeting with the Japanese, and the Japanese made him an offer he couldn't refuse. So he then served as a Japanese collaborator for a while when Japan took over Myanmar in World War II. And then during the end of the war, he finally realized Japan wasn't there to liberate Asians from the European colonialists. They want to be the new imperial masters. Then Aung San worked with the British to get the Japanese out again. At the end of World War II, Britain already promised it will give independence to British India, of which Myanmar is a part. So, the Burmese nationalists also demanded independence. And Aung San was able to sit together with all different political parties in Myanmar to sign so-called Panlong Agreement, which is kind of the foundational document for the modern state of Myanmar. But he was assassinated very soon afterwards. So he became kind of a heroic figure in like the Myanmar national history. And Aung San Suu Kyi is his daughter. Of course, she inherited that prestige. She came from that lineage. And because of that, and because the mismanagement by the military junta, since the independence, the Aung San Suu Kyi's fashion comes off very good. And that is why they have a lot of popular support, because there is a lot of real, genuine popular discontent with the military government.
As there would be. And this is another thing that we also would do well to bring in the wake of this decolonization period where Myanmar attained independence. We have heard from another guest, conversations with another guest, KJ No, that basically different ethnic minorities had been given a sort of tentative promise that they would be granted the right to secession, that they would be granted the right to independence after some period. Yes. And the country has been in a constant state of ethnically driven civil war since then. It's sort of known derogatorily as like the longest running civil war in the world, basically. And this is all an extension of that. And here's a couple of things that I wanted to say. And before I pass back to you, we're going to go into a break pretty soon here, but I want to get your takes on two things. One, Aung San Suu Kyi was in house arrest for so long that even though she's a political leader, I would argue that she lacks a lot of the experience that you would, assume she'd have if you think, okay, she's been in power for decades. She hasn't. She's been out of it for the most part. She's been in house arrest. It's just that she has political weight, which, whether you're talking about the Rohingya crisis or some of the less than deft political maneuvering it seems she's made or her party's made, that might come into play. In other words, she might be a figure, but she actually lacks some of the skills or at least experience that you would hope she would have. That's point one. I want to get your take on it. Point two, actually, just let's go with that, because we've got to go into a break pretty soon here.
Yeah, that's a good point. But you have to remember, Aung San Suu Kyi is not just by herself. She is a brand. Her dad, just like her dad Aung San was a brand. I mean, she has a brand name. And she has all these people gathered behind her. She is a leading figure, of course, but she has many advisors advising her on what to do. But in terms of her, she's not. You're right. She's not like a very skillful politician. Because she was basically come from the wild. The reason she was in the position where she was largely due to her dad, right? And also because her British upbringing, she has a lot of backing from the West, she has a lot of international support. And those are the real reason that propel her to power. But you're right. It doesn't mean that she necessarily is a great leader, but, at the
nevertheless
point,
a popular one.
Yeah, but at this point, because people are so fed up with the military junta, it seems like anything.
They will just go back to her. Well, but okay, so I was going to go into a break, but this is where it gets kind of fascinating. And this is where we return to the sort of question or topic of the conversation, whether this will work through 2023 and beyond. If it does, it seems like there's some serious cultural reconsolidation or something like that. They need to refigure out a national identity. I say that from the West and across multiple seas, acting as if I know what they should be doing, but it seems like that would be inevitable. And Aung San, the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, the founding figure in the country, she's his living extension. The military junta opposes that. And if they want to oppose that categorically, isn't it like trying to create another country in some sense? Isn't it? Wouldn't they have to seriously shift the history they come from? Or do you think it would even work? Do you think that this junta will survive the next couple of years, or do you think it will perish? Carl?
Well, that's not actually. The military junta has been doing this for decades, right? The way they do it is they spin it as Aung San Suu Kyi is an agent of the West, right? They list out his close tie with the British and the Americans, and they present her as a foreign agent in Myanmar.
Is there legitimacy to that? I mean, like you said, when the United States allowed or removed the sanctions, they removed the sanctions with the idea that she was going to be this kind of co-power sharing, and she was the person who they used for it. So are they entirely wrong on it?
Well, she's definitely very close to the West. I mean, these are the people that support her. I mean, there's no reason she wouldn't be. But I don't think she's just a proxy, let's say, because when she took power, there was a certain expectation, say, from the United States that Myanmar will distance itself then from China. That did not happen under Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi went to China, met Xi Jinping, and because Myanmar and China remain neighbors and they have to maintain neighborly relations. In fact, the Chinese investment in Myanmar increased under Aung San Suu Kyi because the international sanction was lifted.
Well, there. That's a really good point. So how does China factor into this from your perspective? Because we've had...
Right. So from China's perspective, China's primary concern is stability on its border. The last thing China wants to see is a return to civil war. But unfortunately, that is what's happening right now. We are returning to an earlier Myanmar when there's a different ethnic strifes on the periphery. Whereas at the core of Myanmar, the Burmese majority, most of them are on the side of Aung San Suu Kyi. Aung San Suu Kyi do have popular support among the ethnic majority of the country. The Myanmar military junta is not popular. They will, the reason they're in power because they have the guns. That is a real reason. They do not have any mandate from popular
And it's not an
support.
issue of popularity. It's basically literally just weapons. I'm curious, what about the other ethnic groups? From our understanding, there were other armed ethnic groups that are also in Myanmar that are basically struggling for their own, you could say their own part of land, almost like little militaries within the context of the country.
For the other ethnic groups in Myanmar fighting for their independence or autonomy, nothing really has changed since 1947. I mean, they have been trying to get their either autonomy or independence since then. It's just a non-stop kind of. There's with war with ceasefire in between. Now is with just more intensified hostility resume. I think. For the people who living on the periphery of Myanmar, nothing has really changed.
Okay, let's do this. Let's take a break, and we're going to bring you back because I want to get into something that is taking place in China, where I was enamored by yesterday. I guess all of us were. This commercial nuclear reactor that is going to be basically using, I think it's called thorium, salted thorium, as opposed to uranium. And this is going to be a product that they're going to sell. I mean, that's phenomenal. China's making strides. And I kind of want to get into other big projects that are taking place in China right now that might be of interest. So the voice that you guys are listening to is Carl Jha. He's host of Silk and Steel podcasts on China and surrounding regions and their history, culture, and politics. You guys can follow him on Twitter at Carl Jha, Z-H-A, and his podcast on Twitter at SteelSilkN, and subscribe and support on patreon.com/silkandsteel. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, and I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And so, as we mentioned yesterday, the Chinese government scientists unveiled plans for first-of-a-kind experimental nuclear reactor that does not need water for cooling. Now, this is a molten salt nuclear reactor which runs on liquid thorium rather than uranium, and is expected to be safer than a traditional reactor because of molten salt cools and solidifies quickly when exposed to air. Now, if you remember Fukushima, there was this issue with water where it required a certain amount of water in order to keep it cooled, et cetera, et cetera. When the hurricane came by, it created all sorts of contamination and problems. Well, this is supposed to avoid that. Not to mention, not using uranium basically avoids some of the problems with nuclear power. To have a conversation about China's, exporting of this or selling this, not to mention the creation of it in and of itself, we're joined with Carl Jha. He's host of Silk and Steel podcast, focused on China and surrounding regions and history, culture, and politics. Carl, thank you for continuing to join us.
Sure. Thank you for having me back.
So the salted, I was impressed by this. Molten salted nuclear reactor that runs on liquid thorium. Now, this is amazing. Can you give us some details about this and even the plans to sell this?
Yes. Actually, this is not a new technology. The thorium nuclear reactor is an old technology that was hot back in 1950s, 1960s. In fact, United States was one of the countries that first pioneered this technology. U.S. was hoping to use thorium nuclear reactors to power bombers, to have a nuclear power bombers that would be able to fly directly to drop nuclear bombs on Soviet Union. And but what happened was the thorium, as opposed to uranium, it does not produce plutonium. So uranium, the great thing about uranium is when you use uranium in nuclear reactors, you get plutonium as a byproduct, which you can use to make nuclear weapons. And so for the perspective of the United States government, uranium is much better choice. They prefer the dual use technologies, whereas thorium, it's not very exciting. They thought they were going to use it to power long distance bombers, but then by 1970s, U.S. already have ICBM that could reach all parts of Soviet Union. So the thorium project was kind of on hold, and just because the United States government just lost interest. The technology itself, as you mentioned, is actually supposedly safer than the uranium reactors, because the current uranium-powered nuclear plants, it's basically they use uranium rods to heat up water, and most times this is very safe, but in the very few cases where things goes wrong, because a lot of heat and a lot of pressure, sometimes this produces a lot of hydrogen, which is explosive gas. That's what happened at Fukushima. And thorium molten salt reactor does not have a problem because it does not use water. It uses salt, and it melts the salt on high temperature. And instead of using rods, they actually the thorium is part of the solution in the solution. So in many cases, it should be safer. But one of the problem was back in 1960s and 70s, the thorium has a problem that it's corrosive. So for a long time, if putting a storage tank, there's a danger that you might corrode the containers. But that now in 2021, though, we have technology that bypass that problem. We have special alloys containers that can withstand the corrosion. So now for China, the thorium is very exciting possibility because thorium exists in much more abundance than uranium. China does not have too many uranium supplies domestically. I think much of the uranium mines are existing in some mountains in Xinjiang in the northwest, whereas thorium is much more plentiful. And China has a big problem with pollution. When the West offsourced all the manufacturing to China, pollution was also offsourced to China. So
this is their way of trying to get around that. Basically, the thorium reactors are a business opportunity, but also a way of dealing with their own issues of pollution.
Yes, because China already leads the world in deployment of solar, wind, and hydropower. But unless there's a revolution in battery technology to store these power, there's really no replacement right now for fossil fuels. So this is where there's where the nuclear power comes in. And the great thing about thorium is that because it does not produce plutonium, like something the material for making nuclear weapons, once China can successfully deploy domestically, they can now export to countries worldwide without worry about sanctions by United States for example, the sanctions on Iran for use of nuclear power, because thorium reactor do not produce weapon grade plutonium.
And again, the economy of scale, what you were hinting at the end, towards the end there, the idea, if you can get an assembly line going, admittedly a marvelously complex one, for producing nuclear reactors, if you can, get the economy of scale going, where you make it cheaper and faster to produce those things, sure, you can sell those, but you can also use those domestically, of course. The problem with, whether it's solar or wind or hydro is a little bit less this way, but solar and wind, certainly, they're intermittent. They're far too intermittent. And so, of course, you need batteries to store the, excess capacity at some times and then to keep it up at other times. Nuclear doesn't have that problem. You can effectively, this isn't exactly accurate, but you can much more easily switch them on and off for effectively constant uptime. Again, it's not as simple as flipping a switch is my point, but you can do that in a way that you simply cannot with basically any other source of energy other than coal, oil, the hydrocarbons, basically. Carl, we have another guest. We've got to go to him, but great conversation.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us. You made it. Carl Jia is the host of the Silk and Steel podcast, focused on China and surrounding regions and their history, culture, and politics. Follow Carl on Twitter at Carl Jia, that's CarlZha. Follow the podcast on Twitter at SteelSilkN, and subscribe to that podcast, patreon.com/SilkNSteel. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back with Misty Winston talking more about the Craig Murray trial on the others. Well, Craig Murray arrest, sentencing, in jail, in prison, when we come back. Again, you're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo. and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. The last week has been a big one in its own way for journalistic freedoms. In a single week, you've had Daniel Hale, who at first it seemed like a bad sentence. Any sentencing of Daniel Hale is going to be kind of harsh sentencing. But speaking with John Kiriakou, apparently that's significantly down from the maximum. Daniel Hale sentenced, I believe it was about 4 years last week. Craig Murray, meanwhile, just a couple of days ago, handed himself into police, and after being charged and convicted, effectively on contempt of court, for his media publication having to do with this Alex Salmond trial. Those are just two big events in the same week. Also, National Whistleblower Day last Friday, to a much less
basically to mock
notoriety. Yeah. I guess as mockery. Yeah. Basically. Anyway, a big week in its own way. And of course, we're leaving out Julian Assange, who, although nothing new happened with him last week, is a constant presence, between the UK and the US, which are the two key actors in this situation. In the UK, of course, with Craig Murray, and in the US with Daniel Hale. To talk about this, we're joined by Misty Winston. She's a political activist, organizer, and co-host of both the Facts on the Ground podcast and Free Assange Vigils. Follow her on Twitter at Sarcasm Stardust. Check out the Facts on the Ground podcast on YouTube and on Twitter at FOTG Podcast. Misty, thanks for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I am doing very well. Thank you so much for having me back.
Thank you so much for coming back. Always great to talk with you, of course. Let's get into it. Big week this last week. What can or should the world take away from this? And what do you take away from it? Misty?
Well, as far as Daniel Hale goes, John Kiriakou is right. They were seeking, 9 years was what the prosecution was really hoping for. So the fact that he got 54 months, which is just shy of 4 years, that's, I hate to say that that's like a hopeful turn of events, but, it was definitely less than I was expecting. As far as Craig Murray goes, this is something that I find very troubling. This is he was essentially in trouble for what's called jigsaw identification, which is really a vague kind of law that they have in the UK, which essentially means that if you publish something that somebody in the public can use along with other information, including other publications or other like pre-known ideas that they have about the case, and they're able to use that information to identify a victim in a court case, then you can be charged for that, which is really kind of terrifying. That this is something that they're charging him with. But he was convicted on
just so we're clear
court.
On that part. White, you could say a white female, and based on, let's say it might have been 10 people, somebody whittles it down based on something that they know. And then the judge says, okay, you're guilty because somebody was able to whittle down based on something that you said prior, even though singularly it doesn't give any information.
Yes, Jamarl, it is very vague. You can literally just say, let's say, for example, there's, two people who work in a lighthouse, and you can say the woman in the lighthouse or a woman that works in the lighthouse made a complaint. Well, if the other employee is a male, boom, you've just committed jigsaw identification. And it's very difficult because as a publisher or a journalist, there's no way for you to know what everybody else is publishing, what other information is out there in the public knowledge. So it's really basically just saying you shouldn't cover this at all.
And this has never been used.
No.
Well, but also,
and this is the first time a journalist will be imprisoned in Scotland in 70 years, and in the UK in the past 50 years. So this is really, really a big deal.
It is a big deal. And when you say we were talking about this, you can't cover this. It's as if we're supposed to know what this is on any given story. I'm sure if we were to go over the history of journalistic, the corpus in the UK, the body of work, you'd find plenty of cases where people have committed this quote unquote crime. And yet it's selective justice. You have to assume that whenever it gets levied against the next one it gets levied against, it's going to be that way just because of whatever story they chose to cover, not the way they went about covering it. Now, admittedly, there's a way in which this can be egregious. For instance, the lighthouse, thing that the example you gave. that actually, if that's the case that we're talking about, that seems pretty damn intentional. If it's that kind of thing, that's not just jigsaw, in my opinion. That's like you're giving away basically the entirety of it. You're giving away all of the facts that somebody would need. But like you said, how is the expectation that they're supposed to be omniscient, that they're supposed to, on any complex, constantly evolving story, that they're supposed to be have 100% uptime, paying attention to what everybody else is saying, so that they can know how they're supposed to bob and weave in that dance of information that you're playing? It doesn't work. So isn't it just selective justice?
Yes, it is. It seems very selectively applied. You mentioned that other people could potentially be found guilty of this. Other people were guilty of this. There were people in the mainstream press who did very much the same things that Craig Murray did. And the two articles that he's being held in contempt for, one was 11 months before the trial, another one was 7 months before the trial. And at no point during the trial did the judge ever say, "Hey, this violates, the court's ruling. You need to take this stuff down." They waited until after the trial was completely over, and then they went after him. So it seems like a very intentionally, process law, like the way that they're handing it down on Craig Murray. He's not the only one that did this. He's not the only one that published things in this manner. So it seems very intentionally directed at Craig Murray.
Just so I'm clear, this was 7 months before the trial?
Yes. There was an article that he published on his blog, which is craigmurray.org. It's not a huge viewership. It's not like one of the major publications in the UK. Right. One article was 11 months before the trial. Another one was 7 months before the trial.
So
and this is the trial of Alex Salmon in Scotland.
But how are they holding him accountable for something that took place before the ruling was even put forward?
Well, because eventually, once the trial took place, the judge ruled that you couldn't do any of this jigsaw identification type of journalism, and because Craig Murray then, I guess, didn't take down his publications, they were able to find him guilty for that.
That is horrendous. I mean, that just sounds
it's really scary.
Horrendous. I mean, basically, I put something out months in advance. YouTube, let's take YouTube, or the government says we are now in process of this trial. Mainstream media covers it. It puts you in mind of what took place in the United States on some level with the January 6th thing, where you would have people covering it. So you would have like Jordan Sheridan covering it. You'd take in the video and everything else, and they would stop him on YouTube from covering it while simultaneously allowing mainstream media to use their video, or for that matter, to use Congress to use it. I mean, that's screwed up. I mean, because this wasn't a situation that mainstream media was held to, or was it?
No, it wasn't. I mean, and again, like I said, there were people in the mainstream press who very much did the same thing that Craig Murray did, and not one of them has been held accountable for the same thing. So again, it seems very selectively applied, which is really scary to me that this is something, I mean, again, I'm an American, but this is something that we're seeing happen across the globe. There's been a global attack on journalism for a long time now, and it's really just been ramped up.
And the Free Assange movement has been like an active hub for people willing to advocate for whistleblowers. And again, Craig Murray, not a whistleblower, that's not what we're talking about here, but simply a journalist and former politician, former ambassador, doing good journalistic work.
Which he was a whistleblower, by the way. He did blow the whistle on the human rights abuses in Uzbekistan, which he was, the ambassador to.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. A good correction on your part. That doesn't pertain, it doesn't. That's not what we're talking about in this specific case, but 100% a valid correction. And thank you for that. I think my point is, generally, the Free Assange movement has been a good hub for people willing to support, anybody acting in that capacity, anybody doing good journalistic work, trying to, show what the government's done. Often, of course, whether you are a whistleblower who's actively suppressed, as you would be, for directly revealing information that would serve to condemn and inculpate anybody, any elected official, any of the politicians we're talking about, this kind of thing. Or you're just somebody who's talking about it. It's like the chilling effect is applied segmentally to these different ways of reporting on it, whether you're doing the active investigation, whether you're doing publication of the stuff. I guess the point that I'm making a little bit poorly is it's a way to target any means of getting accurate information out about the dark underbelly of the establishment. And it seems intentional that you would effectively prevent anybody from talking about it in any way. Misty, we've got to close here, but the Free Assange movement's been doing very good work on this. Looking forward, where would you direct people to learn more, to get involved, to advocate as we close out?
I would just say, you can go to places like AssangeDefense.com or ActionForAssange.com. There's a lot of different calls to action on both of those websites. You can go to the Courage Foundation that does amazing work for whistleblowers and for journalists. Mostly, we just need people to pay attention because these cases very rarely get any attention whatsoever. I mean, if you paid attention at all to Daniel Hale, it was because somebody, showed it to you because mainstream media didn't touch it. So we really just need people to start, getting their ear to the ground and paying attention to these cases and raising noise about it because the more that they can do it in quiet, the more that they will do it and get away with it. So we need to start standing up for our truth tellers and making sure that we're getting the information out there to the best of our ability.
Not donating money? I mean, you already said that. I'm being a little bit silly here, but basically, follow the news. You're telling people this sounds not too bad at all. That doesn't sound like something worth resisting. That sounds like something we all should aspire to. Misty Winston, that's something that's kind of fun. Not to mention, Misty Winston, thank you for joining us. Good conversation. Misty Winston is a political activist, organizer, and co-host of both the Facts on the Ground podcast and Free Assange Vigils. Follow Misty on Twitter at Sarcasm Stardust. Check out the Facts on the Ground podcast on YouTube and on Twitter at FOTG Podcast. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, coming back with headlines and the last hour of this morning show. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another hour, our last this morning, of the most disruptive show covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states we call America and the increasingly divided, fragmented surface of the globe we call Mother Earth. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on Mother Earth, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. There are two wolves inside of me, Jamarl, and one of the wolves gets bored in the third hour in my intro and wants to change things up and wants to insert some novelty without any premeditation, and then the other wolf is afraid and panicky, and I do that, and the other wolf is like, "What are you doing to me? Why are you
that wolf is wise because trying to do that on the fly is treacherous.
It sometimes leads to mistakes.
Yeah.
But let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, there are about 135,800 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. Also about 454 new deaths. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 85,800 cases per day. That's an increase of 142% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 50% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. We have reached the 50% threshold, which is satisfying for the little OCD part of my brain. 58% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected about 35,175,000 people across the United States. It has killed 613,400 of us. Meanwhile, we haven't seen this high of a single day caseload, single day of new cases, since the first days of February earlier this year. That was near the peak of the winter cold and flu and COVID season. And again, we're resuming those heights, it seems, right now. Biden reached his July 4th vaccination goal today, about a month late. That goal was 70% of American adults vaccinated. We have just passed that number. And again, the 50% number I gave earlier, that's all Americans, including kids. 70% of adults vaccinated as of this morning. In national news, New York Governor Andrew Cuomo was grilled by the two officials investigating allegations of sexual harassment against him. For about 11 hours, Cuomo was videotaped while being interviewed by June H. Kim and Ann L. Clark, who were appointed by New York's Attorney General Letitia James. This interview followed months, not necessarily just 3, of interviews with former and current aides to Cuomo who have accused him of sexual harassment. During the interview, Cuomo reportedly suggested that Kim had an axe to grind with him after Kim investigated Cuomo's shutdown of an anti-corruption panel in 2014. The District of Columbia's police department has stated that 2 more officers who responded to the January 6th riot have committed suicide. This brings the total of suicide by officers who responded to the event to 4. And a good way, albeit as, this isn't the most direct thing, but how many police officers attended the event and how many of them have died since then? And then you compare that to the average base rate at which your average police officer is going to kill themselves. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In other words, what's the suicide rate for people who did the January 6th protection stuff versus your general police officer in the population? You'd get a differential. So if it's like there were 300 police officers there, which is probably pretty damn far off the mark, 300 officers there, 4 of them have killed themselves. That's more than 1 in 100. That's a pretty damn high rate in far less than a year.
And then the person, unless the person wrote, this is me doing this because of January
X and Z and Y.
Yeah, right.
You have to fill in the blanks.
Just leave the Just leave the note.
Interviews with family members who were like, she had been really depressed, or he had been really sad after this. He'd been talking. She'd been saying this kind of thing. Like, that's how you get that. That's the best way you'd get that at this point.
Because I don't think they're going to put a postie on themselves and it's like, all right, this is me dying because of January 6th.
The assumption is that statistically this is an aberration. That there is something weird about January 6th, or at least something weird about what's happened since then. That's
because you can get a skew in the numbers. Like in the regular society, the percentage of this much in regards to suicide,
weird
but
stuff
in this,
happens.
it's much higher. It's that type of stuff.
Simple statistical aberrations happen, but maybe there's something deeper.
I'm really curious about why and whether or not the family knows anything about it. Like, was something going on during the time where they decided to do this? January 6th just seems, it's anomalous. I'm more interested in what comes out after.
Yeah, that is true. An aberration, an anomaly, such clinical terms we're using for what some would call an insurrection. I think you have in the past. In international news, Ukrainian police are investigating the murder of a Belarusian dissident and activist who organized a house for exiles from Belarus in Ukraine. After the man was reported missing, he was found hanged with a broken nose. At least 40 Afghani civilians have been killed in the last day as fierce fighting is ongoing between the Taliban and government forces over the province of Helmand. Thousands in Kandahar and Lashkar Gah have been displaced so far. China is set to test the entire population of Wuhan for coronavirus cases as the case count ramps up in the country. Authorities have attributed the increased spread to the raging Delta variant. In Olympic news, Simone Biles competed in the balance beam event yesterday and took bronze. Biles was seated in 7th but jumped to a 3rd-place finish. She lost gold to 16-year-old Chinese sensation Guan Chen. Second place was the other Chinese gymnast Tang Xijing Tag. This is almost certainly the last medal for the 24-year-old Biles, but she is very proud of what she was able to overcome, reportedly. I will come back to this. Jamarl's shaking his head, but I'll come back to this because I had a little piece to say too. Belarusian Olympic runner Kristina Simonskaya has been granted a visa from Poland after she was nearly forced to fly home in the middle of the Games. Kristina publicly criticized her coaching staff, which sparked a heated debate back home that prompted the regime to apparently crack down. Her husband fled the country to Ukraine, I believe it was, and then her parents are apparently being pressured by the government to get her to change her mind, get her to act differently in this situation. Anyway, Kristina was brought to the airport and refused to board a plane back to Belarus. She instead approached police seeking asylum from the International Olympic Committee and social media. So far, the medal leaders from the Olympics in order are the United States, then China. The U.S. is now up by 2 over China. Russian athletes in 3rd, Great Britain in 4th, and Japan in 5th. China has the most gold medals, however, with 32. The U.S. follows at 24, and Japan with 19. Last headline here, in Earth and Science news, scientists have been able to see the backside of a black hole for the first time and have proven Albert Einstein's theory of general relativity correct. The black hole is 55 million light years away. It's 6.5 billion times the mass of the sun, and it's bigger than our entire solar system. Using a high-powered X-ray telescope, researchers were able to confirm the massive gravitational pull of a black hole warps the fabric of space, twisting magnetic fields and bending light waves. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Yes, black hole. Let's go back to this for a second. Just to restate what actually is the news here. Einstein's theory of general theory of relativity. Right. basically stipulates that black holes, as an immensely dense gravitational force, a massive force, will distort space-time around them.
Right.
And that, theoretically, that's testable.
Right.
That's not just a claim out in the sky. You can test that. The big news here is they are effectively proving that. That's at least the headline sort of summary of this.
Yeah.
By looking at the other side of a black hole. Now you think to yourself, wait, how can you see the other side of a black hole? Complicated systems of mirrors spread throughout the galaxy? No. If black holes bend space around them, then you watch, and at a certain point in a certain part of the way that things are getting bent, you will see photons being bent. Again, photons are technically traveling in a straight line.
Only travel in a straight line.
But space-time is bending them, so from their perspective. Anyway, photons being bent from the other side. You can see what's coming out the other side because little bits of those are being bent, and you can imagine.
It's like I'm looking at you, but I'm seeing your back.
Yeah, this sort of parabolic, weird sphere that you see when you see a black hole, because of course black holes are black. You don't actually see, very little light doesn't escape. You see things being bent around them from the other sides, basically.
They just recently was able to see the black hole like just full bore with the telescope, and what you see is basically light going into it. And so it's like, as light is going into it, sometimes you have other stars that are being absorbed and stuff like this, but you get to see the particles of light going around it and whatnot. In this scenario, they saw behind it. I mean, Einstein has a lot of weird stuff that he gets credit for, like relativity. It was like, yeah, this sounds about right. The equation sounds about right. But the moment that you put in satellites, and those satellites are going around the Earth, you need relativistic equations just to ensure that those satellites are in the right location and everything else.
Keeping time the right way and all that.
Keeping time the right way and all that stuff because of the gravitational well, and gravity warps time and space, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, in this case, they're seeing this warped in dramatic fashion. I mean, this is bigger than our solar system, right?
Yeah.
Like, and it's like when you're trying to place that, you're like, wait, how big is that?
wait, what?
It's like, what?
Exactly.
I mean, the sun is going to get to a point when it starts to extinguish, where it starts to burn heavier and heavier elements, at which point it expands to the point where it will gobble up our entire solar system. It's like, it's hard to fathom the sizes and the scales of the stuff. But we're talking about stuff that's with magnificent size and scale. And so, yeah, I mean, but the ability, but it's so warped when you think about it. You're looking at something and you're seeing behind it. And it's like, okay, how does that work? And it's like, well, there's so much stuff that space is being basically warped in such a way where you can see behind it. It's like, wait, so space is being warped? Like, that stuff gets so out there. It is phenomenal.
Well, and also, this is kind of technically a tangent, but photons are, and just in general, the whole electromagnetic field, it's pretty interesting stuff.
Yes.
So there's obviously the wave-particle duality that's been done to death. We could talk about that. But
oh, man, that is...
The idea that photons are the quanta of the electromagnetic spectrum. The photons are the sort of these little force carriers.
Yes.
They're these... And they're, again, both an object in the form of a particle, but also exhibit the properties of a wave, this sort of continuous gradient-like quality without quantized. Again, quantization is basically like taking a continuous quality and separating it into discrete units, like taking the number system, which is every number between 0 and infinity, or negative infinity. You get my point, including all the, infinitely subtle gradations between 0.00, et cetera, and the next
Each
one.
one of those are discrete bits, right?
Exactly, and then we separate it into the individual numbers, and of course in the highest level into 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, et cetera. That's a kind of quantizing of this whole space. Photons in a similar way, if you look at them as a particle, they're like discrete units of electromagnetic energy, which is a basic force in the universe. There are these different forces, the weak force, the strong force, electromagnetic force. Some people combine them in different ways, so you get like the electro-weak force. There are these, you're trying to unify things to make sense of them through shared laws. The point being, light, what we see, which is like, oh, it's just striking our senses. It's just something that exists in the universe. No, it's the force carrier for like a fundamental thing. We're seeing X-rays. The X-rays that we're seeing, we're technically seeing photons. I'm not saying two different things. X-rays are just a part of the spectrum, and photons are everywhere along that spectrum. Because photons are the force carriers for for that spectrum, for the thing that we're describing.
Because what we see is just a really tiny narrow band of light. Like, I mean, light goes all these wavelengths and everything else. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's fascinating when you think about it. I mean, the particle wave duality stuff, oh my God, that gets just fascinating. But you're right, this kind of discrete force carrier, and they use that thing for all sorts of experiments and everything else. One of the most interesting things that I read recently had to do with, they always tried to combine the forces. It's like, okay, we have gravity. All right, great. All right, here we have the equation for gravity. Great. And then Einstein said, well, gravity is a permutation of space. It's like, okay, so how do you combine it with the other forces? That's where it gets weird.
Yeah.
And I remember reading an article recently where they were making a point of, they were trying to argue that the electromagnetic spectrum is basically also a permutation of space. Because they were trying to combine, when I was in physics, I used to take physics as a major. And I remember one of the courses, he was saying, okay, here's quantum mechanics, and here's the equations for gravity. Now, make these things work, and I'll be back.
Solve modern physics.
Solve modern physics.
Basically.
And it's like, of course, the answer is you can't. They don't match. The quantum equations for quantum mechanics, these tiny, tiny, tiny small things, don't match the things for real big. But what if it's also a permutation of space? Like, what does that look like? Meaning they're trying to combine these forces, and the moment that you can combine gravity and electromagnetism, oh my God. Oh my God.
Yeah.
Think of the technology that you can come up with the moment that you can combine those two equations. So yeah, of course they're going to try to do it.
And then we slice the electromagnetic spectrum, we slice that up back home and create laws about who's supposed to, broadcast on what parts of it. And then our phones use some of it, and our TVs use other parts of it, and radios use other parts of it. I was looking into this stuff. I got, people go on like these deep dives. I went on a deep dive with the electromagnetic spectrum a number of years ago. I was trying to create, photogrammetry. Are you familiar with this?
What is that? Music or like
interesting.
Like a phonograph?
No, interesting guess. Photo, like a photograph.
Yeah,
exactly. Not a phonograph.
I took it as photo with something else added.
Here's what it is. Basically, you're taking pictures, footage, that kind of thing. You're taking visual things, which are 2D, to be clear. A picture is 2D, of 3D objects in order to stitch those together to create a 3D model. So, for instance, I could take this desk that we're sitting, or the microphones that we're speaking into right now. You get a phone or a camera with a phone with a camera in it, ideally. You get a camera, and you
go around it trying to get like a 3D image of it.
You do a panorama from all the way around it, so you can stitch the different photographs together. I was trying to figure out, I was like,
phones do that now.
Some phones are capable of that now. And before phones were doing that regularly, before Apple came up with the SDK to let people do that, I was like, okay, if I wanted to do this, if I wanted to have a big, interesting sort of, if I wanted to do, I was trying to figure out, how do I do this? How do I do this with just a phone, with a single camera, not two cameras on it, but with a single phone? And I was like, parallax? Maybe you use parallax, objects. And I started to think, what if you could use Bluetooth? The phone has a built-in Bluetooth, which is just technically a little kind of emitter and detection thing.
Right.
It's just using the electromagnetic spectrum. It's sending out pulses basically of information and reading them too. It's doing both ways.
Yeah.
What if you could use that as a kind of sonar, like a short-range sonar? And I looked into it, and it turns out the U.S. military has a project where they use Bluetooth as like a short-range sonar, so they can hack into somebody's phone, activate it, use Bluetooth to ping the surrounding location. And it's not like a dolphin, or it's not going to be as accurate a mental image as a bat would come up with, with it built into it.
But the moment they get to cell tower.
But they get to a cell tower. And anyway, I felt really cool because I was like, I independently invented something that the military did. And anyway, they made it far easier to do the photogrammetry things, and now iPhones do it by default. So I was just a fool who wasted time learning about interesting stuff. We got to go into a break.
That's funny.
So I think I'll take us there. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're coming back talking with Ted Rall about the state of Cuomo after he got grilled for about 11 hours, we hear.
Yeah.
On these sexual harassment allegations. We'll be coming back on that with Ted. You're listening to Fault Lines. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. 520. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Andrew Cuomo, there was a back and forth that we had where I postulated that Andrew Cuomo will get a fourth term. Now, this is entirely dependent upon whether or not Andrew Cuomo is able to escape without any of these charges coming back to get him from these investigations. This is the New York Times. Andrew Cuomo, the setting, even circumstances were familiar. He sat in a conference room table at his 39th floor room in Midtown Manhattan facing a former federal prosecutor with whom he had tangled before. The videotape interview lasted 11 hours, and Cuomo faced a barrage of questions under oath about his treatment of women posed by two lead investigators hired by the state attorney general, Letitia James. So we're going to have a conversation about this with Ted Rall. Ted Rall lives in New York. He is up and abreast on everything that has taken place with Cuomo, and he's been a person that we've been discussing this with. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So what is taking place here? Cuomo had to sit for 11 hours of testimony. I don't think I could sit for 11 hours in general, let alone be barraged by questions for 11 hours. What is going on here? Fill us in.
Well, yeah, wasn't it 11 hours also for Hillary Clinton? Who also had to sit through that kind of grilling after the Benghazi thing. It was about the emails.
No, I think before.
Was it Benghazi or the emails?
It was, I believe, Benghazi. Yeah, before Benghazi committee. And you're right, it was 11 hours, Ted.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't know what it is about that. I mean, at a certain point, it's like, Cuomo should have just, called in union rules. Hey, go home after 8. Okay?
That's so intense. 11 hours just seems so extreme.
Well, it gives you enough time. You can go out and get a drink. You can take a couple of breaks, behind the scenes. I'm joking, actually. It seems like this is a legit investigation. Yeah. Is it being taken that way locally, Ted?
I think there's not much buzz. I think the general feeling in New York is that he's going to get away with whatever he did or didn't do, and he's going to remain governor. But this is it definitely is some serious, aside from being really grueling, as anyone who's ever sat through depositions can tell you, even 3 hours is a long time. Cuomo's an experienced dude. He knows what he's doing. He's very well represented. I'm sure that he fully expects the video of this to be leaked, and that's an important detail here. If you remember the Bill Clinton, Paula Jones position, where he famously
depends on what your definition of is.
Yeah, Clinton clearly told this video would remain confidential and that no one would ever see it. And because if he had known that it was going to be a public performance, he would have behaved very differently. Donald Trump, who's been probably deposed more than any other human being on the planet, is well aware of the fact that these things become public. So he has a tendency to spar with opposing counsel and try to ridicule and say that they're being unfair. Cuomo appears to be rolling Trump style, and he's clearly expecting this to go public. It sounds like he wasn't very cooperative, that he was in full denial mode, as you'd expect. And he's a very cantankerous, aggressive governor and human being, and so he's fighting tooth and nail for his reputation and political survival. And I think so far, I guess my money is right now is on Cuomo.
For a fourth term.
Fourth term.
Beating out his dad, doing better than his dad. His dad 3 terms. You will have gotten 4. I think it's like a couple in a row now with 3-term governors. Am I wrong on that? Where this has been there's been a string of them almost.
Well, he had to change the rules or something, right, Ted?
Yeah, well, no, that was no, he didn't. That was the mayoralty in New York City. Bloomberg had the rules changed in order to run for a 3rd term. But no, New York. As far as I know, there have not been term limits for the governorship ever.
But again, winning over, assuming you're right for a second, beating his dad, again, to put it that simply, the whole like Oedipal thing where you end up winning ultimately, his dad, Mario Cuomo, 3 terms. If he gets the 4th, well, clearly that's a success for him. And I think it might be partly that psychological. But what's changed? I don't want to cast aspersions upon New Yorkers, but there's something about the memory here. It wasn't that many months ago that he was close to becoming the persona non grata, and we were talking about impeachments and he killing grandmothers and touching women and being a general mean guy. I don't think I can say what I was going to say. But what changed, Ted?
I think what changed is that he just didn't resign. People were, the pressure at one point several months ago was so intense that, the 3 of us here were talking about how, he was really on the ropes, that he was about to go. And I think clearly he was being pressured to resign. But his decision not to proved to be the right move. The news cycle moved past him. And, as I've said before, the issue when you're thinking of whether you're thinking of overthrowing the dictator of Iraq or whether you're thinking of forcing the governor of New York to resign, the question is always what comes next? What do you have to replace them? And, the Democratic Party of this state, much less the Republican Party, for whom, like, Rick Lazio was a major star, it doesn't have anyone. There's no one. There's no farms team. There's nothing. There's no one. Who are we going to get? Cynthia Nixon again? I mean, honestly, she's probably our best shot. Or I don't know. Maybe I'll do it if I've got nothing going on. There's no one waiting in the wings who can credibly challenge him. There's no power broker at that level.
I'm sorry, Ted. We are jealous and possessive partners, and we don't want you to be successful because then you'll leave us. Because then you'll get too big for your britches. You'll be like, I won't come on Fault Lines anymore. I'm governor of New York. But no, I'm just kidding, of course.
Have an office down the hall.
No, thank you for that. June H. Kim. This was one of the 2 investigators named by Letitia James. He was the one to whom Cuomo, I believe, said some slightly harsh words, saying, basically insinuating that Kim had it out for him, that he had an axe to grind. This is a follow-on from the 2014, anti-corruption report. I hadn't heard of this. Can you go back? What was this? What was this anti-corruption report? How did it get resolved? How significant was it? What happened? Ted?
Well, so this is a kind of an obscure chapter, but, and I'm not deeply versed in it at all, but the best I remember, there was it wasn't a particular scandal. It was more just sort of like generalized corruption in the state. And there was a sense that there was a lot of cronyism, nepotism in state government, which comes as no surprise to anyone who's familiar with state government. And and basically the governor's office quashed this as best as possible and sort of put the word out. The New York Post in particular was crusading against about this issue, but no one else seemed to care. And with the Democratic Party being dominant in the media and in state politics, it sort of just died. People didn't cooperate, and everyone kind of got the sense that the Don was taking care of it and put the word out that no one was supposed to cooperate, and it was the vow of silence, and it worked.
The vow of silence. Let's do this. Let's take an early break, and I'm going to bring you back because there's no point in starting a new topic before we do it. So I'm going to start it a little bit early. The voice that you guys were listening to is Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall and read his cartoons and articles at raw.com. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history, this week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We're joined with Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall and read his cartoons and articles at raw.com. Ted, thank you for continuing to join us. I want to get into what New York looks like today. Now, the reason I want to get into this, because issues of crime, dealing with issues of COVID and the businesses that were shut down or the businesses that had difficult time reopening. Like even in D.C., there's some businesses that still haven't reopened and things haven't necessarily gotten entirely back to normal, even though they're kind of, if you squint, look like they are. So what is taking place in New York right now? Has businesses gotten back to normal? Has crime somewhat balanced out? Give us just kind of a flavor of New York City at this moment.
Well, it's a pretty grim situation. I mean, you know, I was here at the rock bottom, worst part of the lockdown, and I would say we have climbed maybe 10% of the way out of that.
That's it.
Hole. The crime and homelessness situation, if anything, has gotten worse. You know, things are really. I was driving yesterday across town, and I saw scenes that looked like they were out of that Robin Williams movie where he's the homeless guy.
Yeah.
You know, just like with crazy people, you know, ranting in the street. You know, there's no police. I was biking on the Hudson River yesterday, and there was a guy on a makeshift like raft made of 4 boards going down the Hudson River, ranting and raving. You know, who knows whatever happened to him, and people were just laughing. And I was like, shouldn't someone call the police?
That is insane.
Hudson, there was, and it's just basically, so I would say, you know, I had several friends say, you know, Ted, you said that it was going to become like the 70s again, and it has. And, you know, I don't want to be right.
Now, when you said 70s, what do you mean?
Well, like the cliches of, you know, like, you know, when my friend came here on a high school trip from Virginia, and he looked out the window casualty from at the Days Inn, and he saw, you know, a body go by and smack into the sidewalk below. Just like mad craziness, lots of poverty, random street crime, shootings, a lot of gun violence. You know, I mean, it's really out of control. I think in terms of the street businesses, restaurants, some of them have thankfully reopened. Most have not. Most are still, you'll go into a lot of restaurants and you'll be like, why am I the only person sitting here? And I have to tell you, the Delta variant has put a major chill on the optimism that people were feeling a month ago.
Same here.
People are talking about how, you know, oh my God, what if they lock down the schools again? Yeah. And, you know, I'm hearing interesting things. People are like, no, we're not having that. No one is doing another year of virtual instruction.
Well, I just saw Biden's apparently polling down 10 points because, like you just said, optimism. I mean, the moment that you saw the Delta variant, and it seems like, well, yes, having the vaccine still protects you from the Delta variant. I think it's like 0.0-something% of people who are ill. So it's very, very minor in comparison to the people who are unvaccinated. But seeing what took place in Massachusetts and seeing some of the other stats that are coming out, meaning it's a more complicated way of trying to explain it. Yes, you will be protected. No, most likely you will not die. However, you're not bulletproof and you can get sick just like anybody else can, just with a less percentage or less odds. But having to even make that argument like that, as opposed to 99% of the people that went into the hospital were unvaccinated, 99% of people that died, that's an easier argument to make as opposed to having to like nuance, the explanation of it all. And so I can kind of get it where it's the optimism died under this administration in a weird way. So I can kind of see that. I mean, but in order for New York to come back, I mean, those companies, those shops are going to have to open. That crime is going to have to go down. There's going to have to be some level of cops coming back in order to keep order, or at the very least write tickets. Like, I mean, it seems like this has been going on for more than a year. Is there any way out? Meaning, is there any glimmer of hope that this changes?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, and I've talked to a bunch of friends about this, we're now at a crossroads in this city in particular, but in general, between vaccine mandates and continuing the path we've been on. The general feeling is if you haven't been vaccinated, you probably shouldn't be admitted to restaurants.
Right. I agree with that.
You should probably have to present a card at the entrance, the same way you would have to show an ID to prove that you're over 21.
Yeah.
And I think if we go in that direction, if I did read an interesting piece yesterday about how the Biden administration is pressuring the FDA to grant permanent approval, that's a game changer. If the vaccines get permanent FDA approval, then schools can mandate them, for example, for students in public schools to attend the same way that they mandate the MMR and all sorts of other vaccines to attend. But I don't think the timing is a coincidence. They're saying that's a matter of 3 weeks. What happens in 3 weeks is, Americans are going back to school.
Right.
So I think I think we understand that the economy and our society and our mass psychology is not going to be able to tolerate another year of lockdown. It's just not. So, but I don't know which direction we're going to go. Are we going to continue to not mandate or make people's lives miserable who refuse to get vaccinated? Or are we going to, are these kinds of businesses going to be allowed to culturally and legally insist on, proof of vaccination?
I can totally see that happening, but if that becomes par for the course in a state like New York, what you're going to get is some very vocal detractors, a much larger, silent, sort of resentful population who really doesn't like it, and then mostly other states just not following suit, where you get a drastically uneven response across the country. I mean, that just seems most probable to me. I mean, feel free to disagree as you'd like, of course. But what do you say?
I totally agree. Yeah, no, I think that's exactly how it'll be. It'll be sort of like abortion after Roe v. Wade is overturned. It'll, the blue states will have vax mandates and the red states won't.
And so here's where I would go with that. It's like a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. I don't see us putting lockdowns back into place. And I see Biden getting a lot less pressure than Trump to put lockdowns into place, partly because he's Biden and not Trump, but also partly because we've already been down that road and we don't want to walk back down it. So that's true. Then if the vaccine rate peters out, and admittedly, we just reached, a month late, his vaccination goal, 70% of adults vaccinated fully. We've got that this morning. Hoorah. But it comes at a time where vaccines are, people are more skeptical and more cynical of them than ever. And I'm reminded the mask mandates, which is most of what we talk about. We talk about vaccine passports, but when we talk about mask mandates, usually here in the States, we don't talk about the government literally forcing people to wear them forcing people to take them as far as I can tell. We're talking about businesses requiring it, the government allowing that, and this becoming a culturally accepted, condoned, even supported practice, that kind of thing. I don't think that would work. So we're stuck in this hard place. We're not going to lock down. We're not going to reach a good enough vaccination rate to beat out Delta and whatever worse variants come up, which means we're going to be stuck in this purgatory for the foreseeable future. And add on to that, it was late last year, plenty of Democrats talking about how, and in my opinion, plausibly, they were distrustful of the vaccine, whether it was the mRNA vaxes or whether we're talking about Johnson & Johnson. This got rolled out too quickly. That was the claim. This got rolled out too quickly. Anything that comes out with less than a year of study, I'm not going to take. That kind of messaging was standard back then. These are technically experimental. I think it's worth reasserting that. I was excited to get mine, and I don't regret it. But for, putting people in a situation, I guess, would a helpful alternative, would this be better? This seems like a useful compromise for me. Okay, restaurants can require you to get vaccinated or have negative tests. If you have recent negative tests, admittedly, that's a cost that people would have to pay. But if you really don't want to get vaccinated and you still want to live the high life, would that work? What's your personal opinion on that, Ted? Would that be enough for you?
Well, I think it would be enough. It certainly would be enough for me. First of all, a lot of places offer free COVID testing, so the cost isn't really a factor for most people, I think. So if people are so strongly opposed to being vaccinated that they just, they would rather get tested, every few days before they go out, just so that they can go to a diner, God bless them.
That's the cost. That's the cost. That's the thing. I wasn't talking about a literal financial cost. It's that. It's having to do it every couple of days if you want to go out every weekend, basically.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like, look, it's kind of like a version, it's a tighter version of the cost. I wrote about recently on my Facebook, and I have a piece coming out in the Wall Street Journal about how I opted to get a third vaccine. It's coming out on Thursday. And people were like, well, watch out. They want you to go and get a new booster like every few months so that Big Pharma can make money. And I'm like, and I won't get COVID?
Right. Right. Both of those things are true.
I do lots of things, every few months. So, yeah, I can do that one. So I think, so people, people can go and get a COVID test. It only takes maybe 10 minutes. No big deal. Sure. That would work for me.
I mean, I think the thing is, though, that the COVID tests aren't necessarily overtly accurate. I mean, I guess it's not the greatest of things, but if you're getting it constantly, I suppose, just over the course of time, the accuracy of it may be okay. I'm realizing how Biden failed in this. They came up with the idea that, okay, if we're going to open up the economy so people with the COVID shot can basically go into businesses without masks, great. Who has the COVID shot? Oh, we don't know because we're not checking. So basically, you were saying that to try to get people to get the shot with the thought that those people will be able to go back to their life, with the catch being that because you're not checking, the people who are unvaccinated no longer have an impetus to get vaccinated, if that makes sense. Meaning, it's one thing if you were checking in the businesses where that person went in, it's like, okay, that person's not vaccinated. You can't come in without your mask. But because they're not checking one way or the other, you basically open up your system without having any of those restrictions in place. It's just very weird that he went this route with it. What do you think this goes, Ted? What's your prognostication going forward? Do you think this gets better? Do you think that the public starts to put more pressure on the unvaccinated to get vaccinated? How do you think this goes as it propagates? I'm just curious. Your thoughts on this?
Well, I mean, if my social media feeds are any indication, I mean, this is a raging controversy where people are just furious at each other.
Yes.
Both sides. It's probably no other issue that people are angrier about. And so I do think this is
And wait, just to be clear, you mean the vaccinated against the unvaccinated?
Exactly.
Because from my standpoint, I look at it as, okay, you guys are screaming individual liberty. What about my individual liberty not to get sick from a mutation that basically, grew up in your petri dish body because you didn't necessarily want to get vaccinated or due diligence to not get infected? I mean, that's the way I see it, and that may be somewhat unfair, but I don't necessarily think so. I mean, you tell me, Ted.
Well, I mean, in this country, it's not surprising that people don't necessarily trust the government. And the history of the Tuskegee experiment and so on. Or soldiers who were vaccinated with junk during the Vietnam War. There's a reason for people to be vaccine hesitant. I think what's happening, when I've talked to my friends who are vaccine hesitant and I convinced them to get vaccinated, I was like, look, I think I had COVID. It was really bad. I thought I was going to die. So are you taking a chance when you get the vaccine? Maybe, but if you don't get the vaccine, you are going to get COVID, and there's a strong chance you're going to croak. And that's the decision you have to make. But in terms of where we're going as a society, we're at a crossroads here, and I think this really is a 50-50, could go either way kind of thing. I mean, either we're going to move toward vaccine mandates, which I think is the economically and socially and psychologically healthier approach to this problem. Or we're going to continue down the path of just sort of, I hate to use this phrase, excessive liberty, where we're giving people the freedom to essentially risk suicide. And that's kind of insane. We're like the Wild West country, but, the communitarian impulse has to prevail here.
So I agree, but I also disagree. And I'm going to say, I don't mean this, and this can sometimes come off in a kind of bad way. I think I hear where you're coming from. I think I get where you're coming from. The way I see it is, it's like a finger trap where the more you try to forcefully pull yourself out of the trap that you're stuck in, the more it sticks you in, the more you're just, there's a constraint there that you're aggravating by trying to very quickly and volatilely escape it. In this case, I'll relate it. If you're trying to convince people of something that you yourself weren't convinced of until it became politically expedient for you to believe it, I'm talking about whether the vaccines work. And if you're going to convince people and they're so burnt out on you trying to convince them, you've lied to them or you've misrepresented the facts, whatever, you've obfuscated things. You said it yourself. People have plenty of reasons to distrust the government. And I'll put it like this. This is a utopian thing that couldn't possibly have happened. In the same way that theoretically, I don't know if you've heard this idea of ours, Ted, but if Biden brought Trump out onto the stage now and tried to come together, imagine, despite all impossibilities, if they stood on a stage together and said, America, we stand together. We fought a lot, but we stand together in our response to COVID-19. We want you to get vaccinated. I'm putting that forward. That's an idea we've talked about. That's a sort of impossible situation that might in some sort of utopian sense, solve the problem, but we're not going to get it. Similarly, if our response from the beginning had been, the government's response had been to not force people, not through mandates, but through helpful explanations and acting as a kind of intermediary between the medical establishment, which can sound like gobbledygook to people some of the time, and the public, who is rightly concerned and even just curious in a lot of cases about how this stuff works, how that's, what the thought process is here. If the government had been a little bit less hands-on in a weird way, but it had simultaneously played a stronger role as an advocate, communicator, leader in the social sense of that position, I feel like we'd be in a much better place. And without having to strain against the finger trap and stay stuck in it, it seems like the more the government tries to convince people that they must do the thing, whatever the thing is, the less people want to do it because we're rebellious. What's your take on it, Ted?
I think you're right. I mean, we talked about this sort of at the end of the last time we spoke about, what the government treating us like children. And, I counter that with FDR's, fireside chats, Churchill talking to England during World War II. And they were honest. I think about like Eisenhower's speech to the troops crossing the English Channel on D-Day, where he told them, look, there's a strong chance you're going to die today, but you're doing it for a good cause, and here's why we're doing it. Can you imagine troops being sent into battle listening to a recording of that tells them, like, hey, you may not live to see the sunset today.
Yeah.
But it's honest, and you can trust a leader like that.
Yeah.
Who's willing to give you bad news and tell you how it really is. And, we just haven't had that. I mean, last time I talked about how Fauci, kind of tried to spin masks. And, we need to get real here. I mean, there's still a misunderstanding, for example, that with the Delta variant, the real risk isn't to the vaccinated. The risk is that the vaccinated are going to transmit it to the unvaccinated, and the unvaccinated are going to die. So, again, it's kind of like, well, yes, you can get COVID and get sick, but it won't probably be very severe if you're vaccinated. But there's a nuance there, and a lot of unvaccinated people are looking at the news and saying, like, well, see, it makes no difference if you're vaccinated or unvaccinated. That's just not true. And it needs to be explained.
It does.
I don't know why this is so hard.
That's the thing. It needs to be explained. And it shouldn't be that hard. Like, we tried to do it on the air. And admittedly, Jamarl and I, neither of us are medical experts. We're not qualified to do this stuff, but we try. And I think in a lot of cases, counterintuitively, we do a better job at it because we're not having to work our way around the political, complexities and sort of unsavory aspects of whatever messaging. You just talk. We got to close it out. But I want to come back on this. Ted, we got to close it out with you. We're going to be taking calls when we come back. I want to continue this conversation going with the guests when Jamarl comes back. I want to get back into this. Just very interesting things to talk about. Ted, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Fascinating conversation.
Thank you.
Ted Rall, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Everybody should follow him on Twitter at Ted Rall and read his articles and cartoons at rall.com, RALL.com. TownStuff.com. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Coming back, we're taking your calls. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, 202-521-1320. Be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. I'm going to be ponderous. I had one thing I wanted to say. We got 4 callers, and really, I don't have enough time to do this, but it's like a thought that I felt compelled to follow up on.
Go for it.
So sorry, folks. We've had these conversations, Jamarl, about, and I brought this up specifically, 20th century propaganda. What does that look like? Radio, TV. Broadly speaking, you got newspapers, you throw those in, but those are older. It's really radio, TV.
Yeah.
This is revolutionary. You have a top-down authority which disseminates information and acting, like the peak of a pyramid or the linchpin that holds a wheel together. It, radiates outward or downward, whatever. There's a single source of authority, a single source of information. Right. You have a command and control economy, which of course you saw with both the communists. It's a uniquely 20th century thing, both the communists and the fascists. It's a uniquely 20th century mode of organizing society where everything is effectively centralized, including the information. Mm-hmm. And it was the peak of that, I would argue. It has gone down since then. The internet, although it adds its own weird biases in, is more like a return to the norm than, this is a new wave of technology. Because I would argue, radios and TVs, what you saw the advent of there was a kind of manicured, fabricated reality where things were controlled. What's seen as true is controlled by a central authority. They have the power to set the stage and lay out a narrative as this totalizing force. And part of what they adopt coming into that and out of that and through that is a certain way of viewing authority. This is what an authority looks like. This is what an expert looks like. This is the way they speak, etc. And we sort of, by buying into these things, and of course not everybody does, but you remember how the Nazis used TV and how radically people responded to it. We were talking about Olympia, the Leni Riefenstahl movie, and how it was so new to people. It overwhelmed them and overawed them, and they were brought under its sway as if it's magic. We describe it in those terms. That thing, that changes how people view authorities on a deep level. The manicured doctor sitting on the stage, you now learn to listen to that kind of person by watching that kind of TV show. It fits the nature of the personality type, the archetype of what an authority is, changes to fit the medium is the fundamental point that I'm making. And here's where I'm going with this. They're still running on that model. You weren't here. You'd stepped out of the room for a second, but Ted was talking, we were talking about messaging and how they should have been more honest. And he was talking about these figures from the mid-20th century, these military leaders who would tell you, you might die. I'm sorry, I'm going to send you out here. You might die, but there's something worth fighting for. Right. And your brothers are going to be at your side every step of the way. We're going to give you all the help we can, etc. That person is brutally honest, and that's the kind of leader you can fully trust and therefore respect. You follow that person because there's something that they believe in. They're able to pull you along with it. Anyway, they're honest. They're brutally honest. That's the point. Yeah. They don't resemble the expert, the model of that expert. And my point is the White House, our authorities, our establishment, they're still thinking in terms of that 20th century model of what that person looks like, how they're supposed to talk, how they're supposed to communicate information, what kinds of questions they're supposed to take, how they're supposed to respond to them, etc. It's not just that they haven't adapted their propaganda techniques. They haven't adopted their role models. They haven't adapted the way these people are supposed to behave, how you're supposed to communicate, all that stuff. And I get it. I'm going to go to calls, but that was my spiel. They haven't caught up, and they need to. Yeah. So many lives are on the line. We got Tarif calling in from New Orleans, talking about China's underground tunnel system. Tarif, you're on. What's going on?
Okay. First, free genocide, free damage, all hands off Haiti. China is developing a whole bunch, I think 10 or more underground tunnels in Tibet area and also in the provinces where they have to alleviate poverty. So these isolated towns that's in between these mountain ranges, they start digging through these mountain ranges to stop this isolation of these towns so they can have more, so they can alleviate poverty and stuff like that. And the born technology became better as a result of doing tens of years of doing this. That's my first comment. Second comment, Robert F. Kennedy came out with a report, with an article saying that coerced medical interventions have been abhorrent to advocates of liberty and human rights, dignity in every age. And basically he was saying that it tramples the federal workers' rights, and it violates the Nuremberg Code, where people can have a choice to take it or not. It shouldn't be forced. I believe the argument dealing with the vaccine thing should have a balanced argument where you have somebody who wants to mandate vaccines and somebody else like a Robert F. Kennedy, which I know is hard to get on your show. I'm going to try my best to reach out to him too, but you can have an argument to hear both sides of the story. That's all I want to say.
I would be down for that specific debate format. We would probably take, one side on that. I'd probably be more in the middle, honestly, because I agree. I don't like people being forced to inject something into their body, which is why at every time when that gets poured, I'm like, gets put forward as an option, I'm like, hey, testing, there should be other stuff on the table here so that not everybody, because who knows how anybody's going to respond to it? Yeah. Who knows what these things actually do? Again, these are technically experimental. I'm in support of them, but
I'm uncomfortable with the force of, I'm uncomfortable with you must put this in your body.
Yeah.
Period.
The vaccine
mandate.
And
it's like, okay, wait, you're going to stick me with this forcibly? There's no other option.
Thing. I saw them bringing somebody out on CNN the other day. This is somebody who, it was like taking the Tuskegee story and trying to pivot people on it. It was somebody who believed in it, and they were interviewing, why did you change your mind about the vaccine? In reference to the Tuskegee story. It's just propaganda.
Well, it's their way of trying to say, okay, well, this person was against it, now therefore, et cetera, et cetera.
Again, but it's manipulation, it's dishonest, and therefore I don't like it. That's my take on it.
I mean, all of it is manipulation, if to be honest about it.
But
I mean,
honest manipulation I can at least respect.
I don't hate if they're saying, okay, here are people who were against it, and now they're for it. And it's like, hey, okay, well, why are you for it now, et cetera, et cetera. I don't hate that. I'm not against that. I mean, we, at some point, I was questioning it at one point. I was like, well, I'm not sure, man. I'm not quite positive, et cetera, and kind of came to this, realization on my own. Is it manipulative to be like, okay, well, this is why I changed my mind?
I get it. And maybe I didn't like it more because it was CNN.
Yeah.
Because of what they're doing.
Well, and I do think they have a specific objective in mind.
Yes, they do. And that's why
I don't buy for a moment that, oh, golly gee, we just stumbled across this particular guy.
That's why they did that.
Yeah.
We get more callers. Pam calling in from Arlington, talking about Biles. Samantha Biles, you're on. What's going on? Simone, thank you. I said Samantha. Thank you.
She is the woman, and women have this thing that happens to them once a month where they menstruate. And when they menstruate, they often do not feel very well at all, generally have a feeling of dis-ease. They can have severe cramps.
You said it.
Pam.
You said it.
Wait. Are you telling me that this Olympic athlete was on her time of the month, which stopped her from performing? Is that what you're telling me? Is that what you're saying?
That was the case.
I'd like to think that we've evolved as a society where none of the men brought that up. It was the woman calling in who brought that up. That she's having these problems because she's on her period. To be clear.
I'm not going there.
I'm not going there at all. It didn't come to mind.
It never occurred to me that could be it.
Pam, good point. I mean, okay. Pam, thank you for the call. We got Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on. What's going on?
I didn't say it.
Yeah, hi guys. Just quickly, Shane, I sent that message to you on inbox with the link to the YouTube video about Fort Detrick in China.
I saw that. I still need to watch it. Thank you for sending that, Michael.
No, that's right. And look, just quickly, you're talking like over here in Sydney, we got a pretty bad Delta. Well, bad for Sydney anyway, bad for Australia. We've had about 3,000 cases over the last 6 or 5 weeks here in Sydney. We've currently got the police on the street door knocking people in lockdown areas. We have certain sectors of the city, which is the western suburbs of Sydney, which is traditionally the working class area of Sydney, in the area where I live. Basically saying, everyone's going to get tested every 3 days. They want to leave their LGA and do this and that. There are helicopters flying around. Some people wear their masks. We're just sitting there, on a park bench, and helicopters will fly over. The police have been called.
Wait, Michael, please slow down very slightly. Just slow down slightly, please.
And we we have the military on the ground here. We have police helicopters flying around Sydney, telling people to put their mask on, who are just sitting on park benches. You have to get tested to leave real GA in some areas every 3 days, right, to go out and do your job. Right, this is a class warfare thing. Like, we have people on the east side of Sydney, which is where all the beaches are, like Bondi and Manly and all these famous beaches and the Harbour Bridge. There was a report, they're drinking cocktails on the bloody beach from cafes. They're buying them in cafes.
Wait, so Manly Beach is still open? I've been to Manly Beach, that's what I'm saying. So the beaches are still open, but they're telling other people to basically mask up, testing, stay in the house, etc.
You can't go and lay on the beach and drink a cocktail, but you can walk up and down the beach drinking a cocktail you brought. I mean, they're trying to shut it down now. They briefly mentioned that they moved on, but they didn't send the police on horseback in there. We've got police on horseback riding around the western suburbs of Sydney.
It sounds like what you're saying is it looks ridiculous, and they're disproportionately applying police power to poorer communities.
And also, these are the areas of Sydney that have the lowest vaccination rates. In these areas of Sydney, like the southwest of Sydney, where it's particularly bad, which is where the migrant communities are, particularly the high Muslim community, who are all refugees.
Yeah.
That's 36%.
And that's the other side of this stuff, is that a lot of the pushback, Michael, thank you for the call. When people talk about the unvaccinated as a class, a lot of the vaccination rate does correspond to like ethnic minority lines in these countries, which means if I wanted to signal the woke police, I don't know what their number would be, not 911, but if I wanted to signal them, I would be like, isn't that kind of racist? Isn't like focusing on vaccinating ethnic minorities? Okay, let's inject all these people with our experimental medical cocktail. Again, I'm being extremely cynical about it. I don't believe it. Couldn't I make that argument? Couldn't I make the racist argument? I think I could. We got to close the show out. But we'll be coming back tomorrow at 7 a.m. Eastern. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Have a great day, folks. Signing off. See you on the other side.